In this podcast, I'm going to cover the overwhelming evidence of 20 years of independent research done by myself in my interviews with Michael Riconosciuto and Bill Hamilton over the theft of the PROMIS software, but now I'm going to show you the research that shows that PROMIS was used for economic espionage and economic warfare by William Casey and exploited by the secret team. Ted Shackley, George Bush, Frank Colucci, Richard Secord, Oliver North and John Singlaub, including Robert Gray. I'm going to provide you with new evidence that shows that all roads of PROMIS lead to the World Bank, the IMF, all banks worldwide, and particularly the Rothschilds banks. As I put forward new evidence, never seen before, I'm going to show you that the Rothschilds financed Inslaw Inc. and Rupert Murdoch's company, Computer Power Group, that were using the PROMIS software, but unbeknown to William Hamilton, Rupert Murdoch's company was integrating it with Stanford Research Institute with artificial intelligence, together with CIA, for the CIA SAFE program, which became the CIA DIA's Iris Swift banking software, put into all the banks worldwide, including IMF and the World Bank, and the Club of Rome banks through Kissinger and Associates, and common investor I'm going to show you is Robert Gray. In addition to that, I'm putting forward new evidence, research that I've carried out over 20 years on one of the directors of Hadron Inc., who has raised serious concerns about an unknown power that has infiltrated and controls the banks linked to the Rothschilds, the Federal Reserve Bank, and particularly he gives many strong warnings about the secret societies of the Knights of Malta, or the Sovereign Military Order of Malta, together with the Circle, known as the 6th Eye, hence the title that I put for my book over 20 years ago, PROMIS Software Affair, the 6th Eye, where they're money laundering drugs and arms in the name of self-righteousness, the name of God, but really under the guise of national security, and it really is a cartel linked with intelligence and mafia and the banks for laundering drugs and arms. And they're a very right fascist group led by John Singlaub, Wackle, the Knights of Malta, with Peter Grace, together with Pat Robertson, and of course the Moonies, and a very far right group of propagandists, Richard Viguerie and also Brian Crozier with MI6, and linked to German, French intelligence, which is a private, independent group that will carry out covert intelligence operations in countries of the United States, the UK, Australia, Canada, throughout Europe, in order to bypass the legislation which prevents our agencies, our intelligence agencies, from spying on their own citizens. Let's begin the story. This is part of a huge diagram that I've compiled over 20 years. And what is not known to anyone else is that the Rothschilds were the common investors of Inslaw Inc. for the PROMIS software, and NM Rothschilds in England was behind Computer Power Group from Rupert Murdoch when it got hold of the PROMIS software from Inslaw. It developed a PROMIS software package for Northern Territory Police. It then developed the LEAN software for following the money with artificial intelligence, integrated with the RAND Corporation and Stanford Research Institute as their partners. And Michael Riconosciuto testified in court in 1991 that the CIA's modified PROMIS software was renamed the LEAN software and sold to the Australian government. Computer Power Group, with the backing of NM Rothschild, also developed the STARS artificial intelligence retrieval systems for James Baker, Secretary of Treasury, and also Secretary of State, and Alexander Haig with Secretary of State. It uses artificial intelligence, and it was a joint venture with Wang Labs that developed the SWIFT banking network and the CIA SAFE software. So over here, whilst you can't see it, the new bits are that Victor Rothschild is personal liaison with Henry Kissinger. Jacob Rothschild started out at NM Rothschilds and then went across the US and New York and started LF Rothschilds, which became the biggest investors behind Inslaw Inc. This is unknown worldwide that the Rothschilds banking group are behind the PROMIS software that has been exploited by CIA to infiltrate all the banks worldwide for the SWIFT banking system so that they can follow the money and also covertly move gold bullion, security notes and funds for the Federal Reserve Bank and also the US Treasury, and more importantly across for what we will prove to you as Project Hammer with Citibank Transaction Technologies, which is identified by Michael in his testimony in court was where the PROMIS software was installed to allow Earl Bryan, chairman of Hadron Inc. and CIA, to covertly move their black funds and gold bullion. It also was identified later by General Earl Cockey, who was representing Nugenhan Bank, the World Bank, and he declared in court, gave his testimony 10 days before he died, that Project Hammer was moving gold bullion from Marcos, Ferdinand Marcos, the Japanese, Russian gold bullion through Citibank with CIA using the PROMIS software. What I'm going to do is I'll pause here and go across to my major diagram. Whilst it's very big, it'll give you an indication of some of the things that are possible. And so we actually have here on the screen is the Rothschilds backing of the software for Inslaw Inc. and Computer Power Inc. In addition to that, I'm going to show you that it was all arranged through William Casey, Walter Remond and Roy Cohen. Very interesting character with these links with representing the legal firm representing the Vatican Bank. But it was financed through Stanley Schumann, Allen & Co., who are the common investors with Earl Bryan with Hadron, and Simcom Inc. I've covered this in previous podcasts. I've proven beyond doubt that they are linked with Ted Shackley, Thomas Kleins, Richard C. Cord, and a whole group of characters. and links back through Task Force 157, responsible for bringing down the Gough-Whitlam government, but also integrated with Wackenhut and across into the DEA with Lucien Conin. I've also shown that they're linked with fascist groups, linked with the Nazi Party and also the Ku Klux Klan, particularly Roy Frankhauser. In another podcast I'll show you that he's linked in shipping for Oliver North and Dwayne Claridge, $8 billion of cocaine with the Medellin cartels, which he's doing with a Mossad agent by the name of Paul Lear Alexander, and they were hiding 500 kilogram packages of cocaine for over 10 years, shipped to Australia and also to the USA, hidden in Siemens transformers. This will be a new podcast that I'll do, but it shows the links of this secret team with Nazis and Ku Klux Klan members. If we go further across, in my research I have identified all the links of the same people: Kissinger and Associates, Henry Kissinger, David Rockefeller, Lucia Jolly, with the P2 Lodge, but particularly the Monte Carlo Committee, an overseeing Freemason group linked with the Knights of Malta, and of course links into the founders of the Trilateral Commission. What is unknown to many people is that Jeffrey Epstein is linked across with the Rothschilds, Lynn Foster Rothschilds and Evelyn Rothschilds, as an advisor and founder with the Trilateral Committee, and hooked across with Mark Rich, and Jacob Rothschild has now set up Genie Energy Company in Israel with Rupert Murdoch, James Woolsey, former director of CIA. Isn't that an interesting development? I will show you that in this presentation we'll look at Citibank. Citibank Transaction Technologies, the SWIFT network, was using the PROMIS software. That was testified by Michael Riconosciuto in court, but also substantiated by General Earl Cockey, who was also a member of the Sovereign Military Order of Malta. And this is a common theme that's coming in. Everyone involved in this PROMIS affair, and particularly laundering of drugs and arms and gold bullion, involved with Project Hammer, Citibank using the PROMIS software, are all members of the Sovereign Military Order of Malta. Common theme that keeps coming through, and its links with the Illuminati. You will find William Colby, William Casey, Ronald Reagan was inducted with Peter Grace. What people don't know is that Danny Casolaro had a confidential informant who was providing information. Her name was Joan Trumps. I've got a copy of her resume. She was the personal secretary and assistant to President Ronald Reagan. And she was also working for Peter Grace in one of his foundations. She was the key source. She's on the roast pig invitation party, but her resume is provided, and I'll do a podcast on that. So there is the link coming back through all of Project Hammer, the Sovereign Military Order of Malta, a link with Danny Casolaro, who was investigating this, and of course we had a CIA former agent, Joseph Queller, come back from Kuwait urgently to assist Danny Casolaro with these investigations. We suspect that he was behind the murder of Danny Casolaro on the instructions of CIA, particularly Ted Shackley, and William Casey, but William Casey passed away, but certainly Ted Shackley, given that Danny had the BCCI checks that were organised through CIA agent Robert Sensi, who was working for Robert Gray. So if we have a look at the history, my research confirms categorically that the PROMIS software was integrated with the CIA DIA SAFE software, the fusion of all intelligence databases, and integrated with Swiss banking with Hadron Inc., Simcom Inc., Wang Labs, and Rupert Murdoch's company, Computer Power Group. I have already covered that in extreme detail, but the most important thing is that in 1982, CIA and DIA released their IRIS software, which is the PROMIS software, and the company called IRIS Corporation was headed by Edward Heath, former Prime Minister of UK, and Robert McNamara, former President of the World Bank. It was installed at the World Bank, IMF, and the Bank of England. And no surprise here is that Rothschild's banks are the biggest financiers for all of these entities, and also was the founder of the Vatican Bank. And of course, Banca Ambrosiana, which is linked to Alexander Haig, Robert Calvi, and Michelle Sindona. That will be another podcast that I will show you. I also have uncovered that through Project Hammer, that Ameritrust and Amerieuropa, registered in the UK, was linked to Lee Wanter and also Michael Cottrell, who I've interviewed, and he has confirmed that his research thesis categorically confirms that William Casey was responsible and working for economic warfare for OSS in order to shut down the economic jugular of Hitler during the Second World War, and hence this is the essence of the links coming back with the Rothschilds, the Sovereign Military Order of Malta, and later on I'll show you that the Raffadine Bank, Iraq London, and a $250 billion US Treasury note handled by Herbert Frost, together with, he was the personal advisor and friend of Ferdinand Marcos, moving all of his gold bullion with Robert Booth Nichols. And I can prove to you that they had set up foundations, Humanitarian Coalition Foundation in the UK and a Vincent Foundation, Isle of Man, and also Citadel Capital Management UK, and these are the common directors that were on there, linked across to Robert Booth Nichols, who turns up everywhere. And this overlaps with my story in Australia, where a bogus prince turns up, part of Operation Stillpoint with Lee Wanter, CIA laundering funds, and he offers to put $1 billion through the United Nations SEAL program, which I'm part of, and destroys the project with the Australian federal government that I had organised. So I've covered that in a previous podcast with the UN SEAL, and that was my companies that I had set up, and we had foundations being established, and it turned out my partners were KPMG and Johns Hopkins institutions, and Spirus, which provides the Rosetta chip for encryption for CIA and NSA, and surprise, surprise, I find that the group that's involved in destroying me, Amcare International with Johns Hopkins, has a director, Frank Bosnell. Turns out he's a director of Risk International Inc. with Donald Walker, and they're the company that employed Major Joseph Queller that was all over Danny Casolaro. In addition, he was linked with A.B. Krongard, who became the executive director of CIA. He was also on the board of trustees at Johns Hopkins, and I had legal action against him at the time, and he's involved with John Reed. C. Michael Armstrong is also the chairman of the trustees at Johns Hopkins, and they're all involved with Project Hammer with Alex Brown, Inc., with Citibank identified by General Earl Cockey. I will do another podcast because during my tour in Australia I have legal contracts with a company owned by President Gerald Ford, who mysteriously turns up. The company's called United Sources of America. I have all the legal agreements offering to negotiate a $100 million settlement for my companies who have been defrauded by Johns Hopkins and destroyed during CIA's Operation Still Point. I have all my letters and agreements signed with Calvin McDowell and Circle Penny, who were the personal and senior advisors of President Gerald Ford. I will do this as a complete podcast because it just shows how unbelievable my story is in Australia, uncovering Operation Still Point and the PROMIS software scandal. What is unknown is that the US Treasury is an equity holder in Citibank, and so were the Kuwait royal family who had financed the checks, the BCCI checks, that Danny CASOLARO was holding. You will find that Robert Gray, Ted Shackley and Robert Booth Nichols are intimately involved with Kuwait, representing and working with the Kuwait royal family, and that's when I found that the directors of BCCI and the people behind the payments of these checks with Operation Still Point have a company with Neil Bush and Ed Rogers called Ignite Inc. It's an education company, can you believe it? But it looks like all of the gold bullion from the Soviet Union, Japan, Philippines and German Nazi gold seems to be coming back through Follow the Money, a company set up by them. And behind that is George H.W. Bush and George Bush, the whole family, and it's linked back to BCCI because it turns out that Faisal Falaj, who had authorised the checks for BCCI that Danny CASOLARO was holding as evidence, was a director of BCCI. And hence we have all the directors with Robert Altman as representative, with Khalid Mahfouz with the Kyle Group and Frank Gallucci. So as you can see, it all goes back to Robert Booth Nichols, the gold bullion that they're laundering through Citibank and Project Hammer with Operation Still Point, Herbert Foster. I have all of the legal incorporation documents in the UK that substantiates everything that I'm saying here. There's 1 billion gold bullion of China, 1 billion gold bullion of Japan, 1 billion gold bullion of Russia that's been moved through the banks with Lee Wanta, who's working for Herbert Mayer, who was personally appointed by William Casey in 1981 to set up the economic warfare program to bankrupt the Soviet Union. So these are amazing components, but let's now go to Le Cercle. Le Cercle is known as 6i. It's a private intelligence group funded by private companies to allow Ted Shackley's team and their fascist secret team to undertake covert operations in the USA, Canada, Australia, the UK and Germany, France, Austria, the Netherlands, Sweden. That would be in breach of legislation in 1977 that prohibited CIA from undertaking these operations domestically on domestic citizens, which is basically spying on its citizens to be able to control leadership and governments and compromise those in power that they'd like to keep in power or get into power. But it really has a definitive link with Alexander Haig, Ted Shackley, Henry Kissinger, Peter Grace, and goes back to CIA Project Paperclip, and hence this is where we now find that their whole private operation for money laundering gold bullion, drugs and weapons worldwide through the World Bank, through IMF and through Rothschild's banks and the Vatican Bank is all with former Nazis and mafia and intelligence agents worldwide. So it looks like, as we follow it through, I have common thread of the sovereign military order of Malta, then linking back to Banca Ambrosiana, P2, World Bank, Bank of England, the Rothschilds Bank, Project Hammer, Citibank, and Trilateral Commission, right down to the P2 Monte Carlo Lodge. And that's where it gets really interesting when we follow the money. And I'll do a whole podcast on these components. I have the letter written by Michel Sedona to President Reagan, where he is threatening to subpoena Alexander Haig. He's written to Stanford Turner for CIA, pleading that he's been assisting CIA and Alexander Haig to launder funds through Banca Ambrosiana. What I haven't done in a podcast and no one knows about is that there is a company called Banca Ambrosiana overseas and in the Bahamas. And it turns out that it's owned by the three bankers, God's bankers, Michel Sedona, Robert Calvi, Paul Masinkas. But their attorney is a 33-degree Mason, Ralph Seligman, and he happened to be a director of Commodore International in the Bahamas and Canada, and yes, you guessed it, with Alexander Haig, who's also a member of the Sovereign Military Order of Malta. And when I trace this back, he also represented Robert Vesco, linked with Mitchell Verbal, CIA, and links across to the Gambino Mafia. Well, that's probably enough on what I've done so far here, but as you can see, I've identified all of the parties involved: Robert Gray, Ted Shackley, Ed Wilson with EastCo, their links across to Michael Hand, Paul Marascus, and Recovery Technology with Michael Riconosciuto, and his company Certec with Albert Hakim and Richard Secord, and dealings with Adnan Khashoggi and Gorbanifar with Richard Armitage back to Nugan Bank. And it just seems to get better, is that we know that we've got the links of William Colby with Albert Carone and William Casey, and Robert Strauss I've interviewed, who was the business partner with Albert Carone, who was CIA. And he confirmed that he was working with President George Bush Sr. and also with President Clinton, and knows about the PROMIS software. So we have a definitive legal link of all incorporations, companies, and I won't go on, but what I found really disturbing is that their alliance with the bankers of Adolf Hitler, Otto Skorzeny, he's married to the daughter of Hjalmar Schott, Hitler's banker, who was also financial advisor to Aristotle Onassis, who was also a member of the Sovereign Military Order of Malta with the Onassis group, with Mitchell Verbal. And this part is not known, but just to let you know how far it goes back into Australia with PROMIS, that the financial advisor and director was a Dr. Andrew Spirou, the father. He is the director for the design of all of Onassis' ships. But he had a son, George Spirou, who is also a director of airship industries and aerostats. Now this is very important. It's a company owned by Alan Bond in Australia and a partnership with Westinghouse. And if you may recall, Peter Wiedniks was managing that company and contracts with US Customs, US Coastal Guard and DEA. And that was the project that Hadron Inc. was working on. So this is independent, and of course Alan Bond, we know that Ari Ben-Menashe has confirmed that Richard Babian, who was working with Stanford Technology with Richard Secord and Albert Hakim, transferred $6 million across to Australia through a Mossad agent, Josef Goldberg, to Alan Bond. And Alan Bond had joint ventures in Lonhro with Tiny Roland. So isn't this an amazing link? Alan Bond cleared the cheque through Pergamon Press Trust in Moscow for Robert Maxwell. I have all of the records of this and also transactions through Allied Irish Bank. I've spoken to the Royal Commission into Western Australia Inc. involving Alan Bond and the government over there in transferring and laundering funds. Ari Ben-Menashe also appeared as a witness, and his evidence was put into a safe for the commissioner. I've spoken to the investigators and solicitors who did that. And of course that comes back to the PROMIS software for the Israel version with Robert Maxwell. So we seem to have, over 20 years, I kept on finding a common thread. The Rothschilds, the Vatican Bank, Banca Ambrosiano, and all CIA agents and anyone else who's involved are all members of the sovereign military order of Malta. And it transcends all borders. It allows for the integration and membership at a high level of secrecy for MI6, Mossad, Mafia, CIA, and the Nazis. And all facilitated through WACL, the Circle, and the P2 Lodge. And this was being set up by Otto von Habsburg. And we'll have a look at him in this podcast to show you how this works. There are far more parts to this, as you can see, but I have identified that the billions of dollars that Robert Booth Nichols was actually laundering was going back to the Isle of Man for these companies linked with Mafia and also former intelligence. International Financial Passport was going to be set up that you could actually launder funds. You're going to be cleared with an international passport. It turns out that it involved Hayward Ishan, CIA anti-terrorism, William Casey, when he was US Secretary to SEC Chairman, and Arthur Levitt Jr. But it turns out that Ralph Ishan, the founder of GH Ventures here, together was responsible for setting up US Foreign Affairs Relations, SALT II, Institute of War and Peace Reporting and Training of Journalists and Activists. Isn't that nice? And also worked with Lieutenant Ralph Ishman. He was director of A2 GCQ, UK intelligence, particularly intelligence against the IRA. Well, they were setting up an international financial passport smart card that allows you that you're cleared to go to casinos and launder funds, given that we give you a green tick that you're trustworthy. You can go into any casino. Turns out they were trying to set up with the Cayman Island Monetary Authority, Barclays Bank Trust Company, Bank for International Settlements, which harbours the Nazi gold bullion. And isn't it interesting that the same people here, the same person, is actually responsible for the 2001 US Patriot Act and cross-border ranking. Well, as you can see, I've been very, very busy. Over 20 years, my research is definitive. You can't make this up. I've located all of the funds and the links with everyone who's linked with CIA and Knights of Malta. Everything purple seems to be linked to the Knights of Malta and the P2 Lodge. And that might be enough for you just to be able to see that I have followed all of the links of all the parties with BCCI, the founders, and how they were laundering the drugs. And this is coming from the official reports and investigations, which no one gets prosecuted. Isn't it just amazing that you can set all these companies up with the definitive records and drugs, arms, and I found all the links of setting up private assassination companies and counter-terrorist groups. And it turns out that Lyndon LaRouche was exposing all of this when Oliver North and Richard Secord sent in Roy Frankhauser, member of the Ku Klux Klan and Nazi Party, to destroy him with Mitchell Verbal. He had published Dope Inc., which identified the money laundering operations of drugs and particularly against Kissinger. So Kissinger, Oliver North, had sent in Roy Frankhauser to destroy him, and I have now uncovered definitive evidence that Roy Frankhauser was then working with the CIA, setting the meetings up, but he was actually attending meetings in the office at White House of Oliver North and had his own office over in Langley with the Counter-Terrorism Centre, and was using his alias William Clay, which was his alias when he was an informer for FBI and NSC, and was working directly with Mossad agent Paul Lear Alexander. Roy Frankhauser was setting up all the bank accounts at BCCI, and they were laundering all of the drugs from Noriega, Pablo Escobar, 8 billion cocaine shipped to USA and Australia, hidden in Siemens transformers. This went on for 10 years, 80s and 90s, whilst Paul Lear Alexander was acting as an informant for DEA. He was reporting directly to Dwayne Claridge and Oliver North. Danny Casolaro had found the prospectus for counter-terrorism consultants registered in New York, being set up by Dwayne Claridge and Frank Colucci, together with directors Dr. James Motley, Dr. Joseph Navarro, with Wackenhut Applied Technology Centre. Well, that seems to be enough. As you can see, there is a definitive link of NSC Oliver North to P2 with the banker Ambrioso Vatican Bank, Alexander Haig. And so we have a secret Catholic organisation, which I will call the Sovereign Military Order of Malta, or the Knights of Malta, together with Opus Dei, and I will now present more of the evidence to show you the importance of the Rothschilds Bank behind PROMIS, with CIA, William Casey, and Henry Kissinger, and Ted Shackley. So, back to our story. I'm going to introduce to you a name that you've never seen before. This man is incredible. His name is Czech Misler. He's a Christian evangelist. I have all of his books, his prophecies and on Daniel, the book of Daniel, the Bible's book of Revelation, Behold the Black Horse, Europa Rising, and the New World Order. And this is what he says. I have all of his audio books. He says, the Federal Reserve, the engine of power. The Bible instructs us not to be ignorant of Satan's devices, and it predicts that as the second coming of Christ draws near, the world will be drawn into a one world government, ultimately to be taken over by a coming world leader. The forces setting the stage for this final climatic chapter may have proceeded further than most people realise. He says that Mayer Amschel Rothschild's original plan of 2 centuries ago for a new order of a one world government appears to be succeeding. No wonder the Great Seal of the United States on the backside of the $1 bill bears the inscription Novus Order Seclorum, New World Order. He then states the Federal Reserve Bill was held until December 23, 2 days before Christmas, before it was presented to the House and Senate. This is back at its creation. Only those senators and congressmen who had not gone home for the holidays, those who owed favours to or were on the payroll of the bankers, were present to sign the legislation. Involved behind the scenes in the elections of Woodrow Wilson and Franklin Roosevelt was Colonel Edward Mandell House, son of the Civil War Rothschild agent Thomas W. House. Colonel Edward House presented the interests of the Rothschilds banks and was originally a member of the Institute of International Affairs, formed in Paris at the Majestic Hotel in a secret meeting on May 30th, 1919. Its American branch, formed on July 29, 1921, became the Council on Foreign Relations. He states the Federal Reserve Act gives a power to the Federal Reserve banks that makes the government impotent to protect the interests of the people. So there's a statement. He's a Christian evangelist. He has written many books over many years. In fact, he eventually left America with his wife and family and settled in New Zealand and ran his Christian ministry. But who is Chuck Missler? And this is the part that no one knows. I researched this 20 years ago, and I was planning to interview him, but he passed away. But I got his resumes and background. He was a director of Hadron Inc. with Earl Bryan. He was appointed the chairman and CEO of Halonetics Inc., the SDI Star Wars program, with Bernard Katz, who was the common investor with Exonics Inc., with Earl Bryan, Dr. Edward Teller, behind the hydrogen bomb, and William Simon, former US Treasurer and Director of Citibank, and Robert Gray, representative of the Kuwait royal family, BCCI, but also owned Eastco and Consultants International with Ed Wilson, Ted Shackley, Richard Secord, Eric von Marbod, Thomas Kleins, and Michael Ledeen. So Chuck Missler is warning the world after leaving these companies. He was forced out. They tried to prosecute him, accuse him of fraud. But he has been on a campaign since the mid-1980s to reveal his concerns of this secret group that controls the Federal Reserve Bank and all banks worldwide, which he thinks is and believes is satanic. I'm going to introduce to you why I called my book The Sixth Eye. My research had uncovered independently through years of research tracking all companies owned by Ted Shackley. And it turns out that Le Cercle was established and also known as Sixth Eye. And it was founded by a secret Catholic group in Europe, and it was the Catholic Opus Dei and the Knights of Malta. It was described by Alan Clark as an Atlanticist society of right-wing dignitaries, and it really is right-wing. It was set up by the French Prime Minister Antoine Pinay and French intelligence agent Jean Violet under the name Cercle Pinay. Also, Konrad Adenauer and Franz Joseph Strauss were co-founders, and reconciliation between France and Germany was an important goal. It says the Cercle's founding vision encompassed the integration of Christian Catholic Europe, an aspiration reflected in Cercle's personal membership in countries represented in early years. The other members of the original Cercle were the governments of Belgium, Italy and Luxembourg and Netherlands, including a number of members of the Catholic Opus Dei. You may recall that Robert Hansen, who provided and sold the PROMIS software from FBI to the Soviet Union, was a devout member of the Catholic Opus Dei, and the Knights of Malta. However, in later years it delved into policy discussions and promoting reforms in post-communist countries, and in June 2004 convened in the Royal Palace in Belgrade under the auspices of Alexander, Crown Prince of Yugoslavia. It also had additions in 1969, Portugal, Spain, Switzerland and United Kingdom and United States. This led to a shift in its objectives, which became the emphasis of forming a strong anti-communist alliance between the United States and Europe. It then goes on to say that it considers strategies to target public opinion. So this is a propaganda company. To this end forms Cercle network of associated organisations, institutes and think tanks, which attacked both the Soviet Union and the perceived leftist governments or opposition movements in Europe and the Third World. And this part's the part that's interesting. Its members were mainly elderly male conservatives, with many belonging to anti-communist organisations including World Anti-Communist League, WACL, hence Richard Singlaub. The Union of South Africa provided the only official delegation, and the Cercle supported organisations such as Renamaro, whose General Secretary attended meetings, and UNITA. In later years, British took over the chairmanship of Le Cercle. Leading member included ex-MI6 officer Anthony Cavendish, and the British Conservative MP Julian Amory. Remember the name Julia Amory and Brian Cozier because they're colleagues of Ted Shackley. And it confirms categorically that Alan Clark, British Conservative MP and historian, stated in his diaries that Le Cercle was funded by CIA. Well, this is what we uncover. The Sixth Eye is really a group of fascists. They're using the PROMIS software for economic warfare and intelligence. Ted Shackley has been playing a leading role with Le Cercle and Sixth Eye since early 1970s. Herb Mayer was recruited by William Casey to head up the CIA's economic warfare program. James Critchfield, who Ted Shackley was mentored, was a CIA agent tasked with gathering information about the Soviet Union from Reinhard Gehlen Organisation. Norman Bailey, NSC Economic Warfare. He met with William Hamilton and confirmed to William Hamilton the PROMIS software was used by NSA for their follow the money program at all banks. Rolf Grage was a German arms dealer and business partner of Ed Wilson with Eastco. And of course, Robert Gray was involved with Eastco, so was Richard Secord, Ted Shackley, Thomas Kleins, and also Michael Ledeen, and also Eric von Marbot. Richard Stilwell. Now, this name is covered in previous podcasts. He was working with Colonel Albert V. Carone, CIA bagman for the Guggenheim Bank and Gambino Mafia, for laundering the drugs from Vietnam through Australia and the US, New York, with the Gambino Mafia. And Donald Jamieson, CIA agent and also a director of Research Associates Inc. with Ted Shackley. This is Ted Shackley's baby. Involved William Casey, Kissinger, but when I went through the incorporation documents, I found the Atlantic Circle Inc. was set up by Ted Shackley as the president with Julian Amory, MP, Conservative MP from UK, Richard McCormack, Robert Zololi, and Thomas Spencer. So now let's look at bankrupting the Soviet Union and using the PROMIS software. In the book The Victory, written by Peter Schweizer, the Reagan administration's secret strategy that hastened the collapse of the Soviet Union. In previous podcasts, I've confirmed categorically that Operation Still Point, which destroyed my companies in Australia with a bogus prince, was laundering the gold bullion from the Soviet Union and the Russian rubles to collapse the value of those by Lee Wanta, who was linked to Herbert Frost with the gold from Ferdinand Marcos. In fact, Lee Wanta had an office over in the Philippines working with Ferdinand Marcos to move his gold bullion. And that involved Robert Booth Nichols. And it turns out that he was working for Herbert Mayer and appointed by William Casey for economic espionage and economic warfare. And so it confirms covert financial intelligence, and it was all started in Poland during Solidarity movement at the heart of the Soviet Empire. And this is where Ted Shackley comes in. His parents are Polish, he speaks Polish, and his first assignment with OSS was to debrief the Nazis in Poland. And so you can see why he's heavily involved with this PROMIS software and moving drugs, gold bullion, and weapons involving Poland and the Soviet Union, which I've uncovered is linked to Admiral James Atwood in partnership with Otto Skorzeny. We're bringing weapons from Poland for Richard Secord, Oliver North for the Nicaraguan resistance, hence the Iran-Contra scandal. And so it's looking at also substantial financial and military support for Afghan resistance. And it's also a campaign to reduce dramatically Soviet hard currency earnings by driving down the price of oil with Saudi Arabia cooperation and limiting natural gas exports to the West. And it was a sophisticated and detailed psychological operation to fuel indecision and fear among the Soviet leadership, and a comprehensive global campaign, including secret diplomacy to reduce drastically Soviet access to Western high technology. It was a widespread technological disinformation campaign and aggressive high-tech defence build-up. And so it confirms in the book, as I had confirmed with Michael Cottrell, who was the business partner of LAUNDERING. His research thesis shows that Casey was working in economic warfare during his time with OSS. And it turns out that Casey signed on. A year later, he was appointed by Donovan to serve as Chief of Secret Intelligence in the European theatre. And his job was, of course, pinpointing Hitler's economic jugular, and so economic warfare. One of the first appointments that he made is he lured Henry Rowan, former president of the Rand Corporation. This is very important, because this is where Inslaw's software comes in for economic modelling and installation at all banks, IMF, World Bank, and also all banks internationally for economic modelling of the Soviet economy, and also tracking ore trade and gold bullion movements and currencies, hence the need for PROMIS to integrate all distributed databases across different vendor computers worldwide. He also appointed Herb Mayer, an editor with Fortune magazine, and by no coincidence we're experts on Soviet economy, and so too was David Wigg, Casey's White House liaison. And so an economist, he was the first to set up the agency system for tracking Soviet hard currency flows and foreign earnings. The specialities of the people Casey surrounded himself with left no doubt where his interests were. It was economic warfare. And so this is the evidence that I'm going to present to you that William Casey's economic warfare program used Inslaw's PROMIS software. I'm going to present to you evidence of the project link, economic modelling. It was provided to NATO, World Bank, IMF, international banks to capture all economic data. And it was used, PROMIS was also used by the US Navy and NATO to track Soviet nuclear submarines. And CIA and NSA used the PROMIS software from Inslaw to follow the money with the SWIFT banking program, installed at IMF, World Bank and international banks. And the last part is where it overlaps with Richard Pearl, who apparently was upset with Paul Wolfowitz and Douglas Faith and Scooter Libby about my research into PROMIS, but he was responsible for the COCOM agreement to track sale of all Western technologies and enforce sanctions against the Soviet Union, Iraq, Iran, Libya and such forth using the COCOM agreement. And I'm familiar with the COCOM agreement. When I was research director for a computer company, I always had to get it cleared through customs in a COCOM agreement with defence when leaving Australia with a computer, and when I returned to show that I hadn't sold it or given it away to the Soviet Union. So this was enforced throughout the 80s. What I'm also going to show categorically is the CIA and NSA economic warfare program was using Project Link. It was set up for NATO, World Bank, IMF and international banks. It involved the Rand Corporation, the Wharton Econometric Forecasting Associates, Stanford Research Institute, who were a partner for artificial intelligence with Computer Power Group, owned by Rupert Murdoch, that had the PROMIS software integrated with AI, and it was set up by William Casey, Herbert Mayer, Henry Rowan and Norman Bailey. So let's go back to Michael Riconosciuto's confirmation of what he has confirmed to myself in my interviews with him, but also in the transcripts of his court case in 1991. The first application was for NATO and the US Navy for the modified PROMIS software for tracking Soviet nuclear submarines. It was integrated into the missile fire control and command systems of the US Trident submarines using VAX 11780 computers. He's also reconfirmed that it was using the VAX 6000 series as well for onboard operations. He also confirms in his interviews with me and in the court case in transcripts that the modified software was for Swift banking. It was installed at Transaction Technologies Inc., a subsidiary of Citibank, for Dr. Earl Bryan, chairman of Hadron Inc. and CIA, to move covert funds through international automatic clearing houses. Well, let's see what other evidence was presented. In previous podcasts, I've also confirmed the testimony of General Earl Cockey that the existence of Project Hammer was set up at World Bank, Guggenheim Bank, Citibank, and used the PROMIS software. He was the representative of the Guggenheim Bank, Washington office, and also advisor with Citibank and the World Bank. And these are the things that he confirmed categorically, that he, former Washington representative of the Guggenheim Bank, special consultant to Adna Khashoggi, gave a deposition running 67 pages concerning knowledge and involvement in Project Hammer. He also testified that Project Hammer was operated by the Federal Reserve. Now this part's very important. The Federal Reserve, Treasury, CIA, FBI, Secret Service security agencies, to secretly recover to the United States the proceeds from their arms, gold and drugs trading activities that were illegally diverted by major banks. Earl Cockey also confirmed Project Hammer was to generate funds to pay off debts on bullion certificates issued by certain metal trusts. The funds were siphoned off surreptitiously in order to rescue numerous major US and other international banks that by the later half of the 1980s were tottering on the brink of bankruptcy. And he also confirms that Project Hammer was the continuation of the operations of the Guggenheim Bank. 10 days later, Earl Cockey died from pancreatic cancer. His explosive deposition reveals him as a very significant and highly connected player in the world few of us are familiar with. He also confirms that Bankers Trust International, a subsidiary of Bankers Trust, was the other Miami bank named in the book St. Peter's Banker, had funds stolen from Banca Ambrosiana. According to the book's author, Luigi Difonzo, these funds were deposited into account number 001050018 that was also controlled by Lucia Jalli and Michelle Sindona. In 1982, Ferdinand Marcos arranged via General Fabian Ver to transfer 50 tons of gold bullion to Switzerland, shipped via two 747 aircraft, and arranged Ron Last to deliver the gold to Bankers Trust in Zurich. This part's very important. Mr. A.B. Conrad was the vice chairman of Bankers Trust, a director of Johns Hopkins Medicine prior to becoming the executive director of CIA. Hence, he's one of the founders, members of the Johns Hopkins Medicine group that I had legal action against over the fraud that they committed in Australia that destroyed me by CIA's Operation Still Point with a bogus prince working with Lee Wanta. General Earl Cockey was also director of Guggenheim Bank, Washington, and Robert Booth Nichols represented 1 billion gold bullion certificates in Switzerland owned by Ferdinand Marcos. He then goes on to show the role that Dan Hughes caused 2 site drafts to be issued in favour of Bankers Trust, collateral commitment to Chase and Citibank debenture instruments, an activity which caused General Earl Cockey to believe kicked off Project Hammer in a big way. And the lawyers and investigators were building a lawsuit for Dan Hughes and other clients cheated out of their money were quietly negotiating with Central Intelligence Agency in an attempt to settle privately out of court. According to Dan Hughes, these negotiations were taking place with the office of Buzzy Krongard, the then number 3 man in CIA. So that's the background. In addition to that, just to let you know where we're going, the neocons are upset with my research on the PROMIS software. I received a telephone call from William Hamilton. He's He says, I've been advised by a trusted source that the neocons are very upset about your research into the PROMIS software. He advised that he's just learnt that Paul Wolfowitz is leading the efforts of Richard Pearl, Douglas Fay, Scooter Libby to shut down your research efforts. Hence the name Paul Wolfowitz becoming the new president of the World Bank, and Richard Pearl, who's managing the COCOM agreement. And hence, I also had a visit from Robert Booth Nichols coming to Australia to threaten me. Your research is upsetting very powerful Israeli businessmen. You do not know who you're dealing with until you receive a crowbar to the back of your head. If you continue with your investigations, then you'll have the military coming down on you. All your problems in Australia lead to Alexander Haig. So, obviously, my research into PROMIS is leading to the World Bank. In addition to that, the source was a Pentagon spy. And it turns out that it was LT, Lambomya Julian Demchuk, who also met with Christopher Story. Investigation of PROMIS, CIA Operation Still Point involving Lee Owanta. So it turns out Christopher Story, who's the financial advisor to Margaret Thatcher, is exposing the investigations of Lee Owanta and the PROMIS software with CIA Operation Still Point. Hence, the overlap with my story in Australia is CIA Operation Still Point, with a bogus prince who's working with Lee Owanta. And so Christopher Story confirms that Gordon Thomas badgered him in New York to get in touch with this operative, who later turned out to be the visitor who used the name Walker as an alias, but his real name, he's a Ukrainian, name is Demchuk. The operative was said to have Pentagon links. Christopher Story also was covering and specialising in investigations in intelligence and economic affairs, and perhaps known for his collaboration with KGB defector Anatoly Golitsyn on the book The Perestroika Deception. And so he also had published International Currency Review, which included the World Bank, the Federal Reserve and the Bank of England amongst its subscribers. He became an econ advisor to Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, and in 1991, a year after her resignation, he published the Soviet Annals List due to continued scepticism about Mikhail Gorbachev and the Perestroika as the official version of events in the Soviet Union. What's more important is Christopher Story investigates CIA Operation Still Point, and also he was meeting and talking, and I've interviewed Michael Cottrell extensively, and he confirms the role of William Casey in economic warfare and working with Lee Owanta. And he was investigating documentary evidence of George H.W. Bush and CIA operations still involving secret trillion-dollar money laundering transactions through Citibank and the World Bank. Isn't this interesting of where we're going? Before Christopher Story died, he was also investigating evidence of Lee Owanta linked to the global security funds set up by, wait for it, Jacob Rothschild. This is now leading PROMIS to the Rothschild Banks, World Bank, Federal Reserve, money laundering of gold bullion, weapons and drugs. To recap my story, CIA Operation Still Point, the appearance of the bogus prince in Australia to destroy the United Nations Trade Point Secure Electronic Authentication Link, known as the SEAL program, established with MyRD encryption companies and the Australian federal government, were completely destroyed. There's some pictures of the bogus prince, Prince Haji Mohammed Al-Sagoff van Aldik, with his passport, appearing at Parliament House in Victoria. But here is the letters. He's the chairman of the Bank of South Pacific Islands Limited, and he's working with Leo Wanta. It's covered in detail in his book Wanta, Black Swan, White Hat, and his appointment by Ronald Reagan to work with William Casey and Herbert Mayer to bankrupt the Soviet Union. Here are copies of his correspondence confirming the NSA, USG/CIA NSA proprietary, consisting of an IBM 3090 digital VAX and its 11 and Inslaw Inc. PROMIS USG software. He confirms that his chairman was murdered. Confirms that they got significant investments called financial derivatives. Again, confirming the use of the PROMIS software. And more important is this: Leo Wanta was in China or the Philippines during the time of a lawsuit, and President Reagan, in the office of, he was working out of the office of the Philippines President Ferdinand Marcos. After the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, Wanta used his currency expertise to help re-establish the value of the Kuwait currency. A letter of thanks to Wanta leaves no doubt of the success of his efforts. He confirms the Kuwait dinar Forex as sanctioned by US government program utilizing Inslaw Inc. PROMIS software. And the proof of his company, Ameritrust, he wasn't doing it for personal gain. Here are his letters to President William Jefferson Clinton, Alan Greenspan, Chairman of the US Federal Reserve, Robert E. Rubin, Secretary of Treasury, who also became a director of Citibank with President Ford. C. Michael Armstrong, Chairman of the Johns Hopkins Trustees. John Deutsch, Director of CIA. This is Operation Still Point, and it's all confirmed on a letter of the Bank of South Pacific Islands Limited, signed by our good friend Prince Haji Aldik. Transfer of funds, creditworthy notes and obligations with John Reed, Citibank. And there we go, further proof. Operation Still Point with Prince Haji Mohammed Al-Sagoff van Aldik, who appeared to make a $1 billion donation to set up a foundation with United Nations Trade Development Centre for their SEAL program, televised worldwide. Also confirming Ambassador at Large State of the Vatican Bank, the involvement of the Vatican. Letters of support. Appointment as ambassador to the Vatican city-state. So we have now gold bullion involving the Vatican. More important, as these go across to President Bill Clinton and Robert Rubin, Sandy Berger, Madeleine Albright. Here's confirmation of thank you from the Ambassador of the State of Kuwait in Spain for him using the PROMIS software to re-establish the Kuwait dinar. Hence, the critical part of the BCCI checks, financed by the Kuwait royal family, managed by Robert Sensi working for William Casey and Robert Gray, for Adnan Khashoggi and manager Gorb Nafar for the Iran-Contra deal, was critical evidence linking the PROMIS software that Danny CASOLARO was investigating. So, going back to other evidence that we have, I have proven definitively of the relationships between Wang Labs, Hadron Inc., and the directors of Computer Power Group with Rupert Murdoch with Stanley Schumann, who is the managing director of Allen & Company. Common investor, they were all developing the CIA DIA safe software, which became the Iris Swift banking software. I also proved beyond doubt that behind all of this was EastCo, Companies Operational System Inc., owned by Edwin Wilson, linked back with EastCo, with Ted Shackley, Thomas Klein, Ed Wilson, Richard Secord, Eric von Marbod, and Michael Ledeen, together with Joseph Capucci, Neil Livingston, Robert Gray, Robert Owen, Earl Bryan, and Lucien Conine was involved with the intelligence systems for DEA. Also, Gray & Co. had Daniel Murphy, worked for President Bush Sr., and together with Richard Viguerie, who also was located at the same office at 7777 Leesburg Pike, Virginia. Same address as EastCo. And there is our previous podcast in detail. I showed that this was all done for the fusion of all intelligence databases and Swift banking for William Casey. It went a little bit more further. In another podcast, we showed that Ted Shackley with TGS International, WACL, Amicare, World Anti-Communist League, CNP, Singlau, Viguerie, Hunt, Grace and Robertson's group were laundering the funds of drugs from Lebanon and also from Nicaragua contracts, but were also intimately involved with overseas press services, Singlav and Seco, which had the C4 explosives. Fidco, with Pender, Mayhew and Murchison, Clint Murchison also employed Robert Sensi. And Claridge and Canestraro had set up the CIA Counterterrorism Center. And so there is a huge overlap of the secret teams, transactions with drugs, intelligence, arms, and it was leading to the cover-up of their operations with the bombing of Pan Am, which destroyed the McKee team, who were coming back with all the evidence. The evidence seemed confirmed that the bomb and the suitcase with the bomb had been purchased from an office adjacent to IBI International Ishvan Babuti in Malta. And Wackenhut was providing all the security for luggage and security of baggage handling for Heathrow Airport and Pan Am worldwide. So now let's look at Chuck Missler. He has given a prophetic summary of the dangers of the Rothschild banking empire and the Federal Reserve, which he believes is setting up a one world government for a future Antichrist. But he, being sworn to secrecy, obviously, of what CIA has been doing with PROMIS software, but also Hadron, Hellenetics, NSA, knows everything. So this puts more weight on the fact that he is worried. And I will attach his speech where he gives warning of the occult of the Freemasons control, secret society worshipping Satan to control the world. And I believe that he could see the pieces. And let me show you the story of his warnings, given that he isn't just your average evangelist. He knows what the secret team has been doing. So he was a director of Hadron with Earl Bryan, Dominic Leahy and Bernard Katz. Owned Exonix. Exonix developed the sonic tow or the sonar towing systems for tracking submarines. Hadron Inc. developed the command control systems for the Trident nuclear submarines. Also involved with AWACS and also the war on drugs aerostats and surveillance for the war on drug and terrorism program under George Bush Sr. But the part that's important is William Simon was the director of Citibank that owned Transaction Technologies that had the PROMIS software and was involved with Project Hammer. He was sitting on the board with President Gerald Ford, who had offered to negotiate $100 million settlement for me, the fraud committed by the Johns Hopkins institutions to destroy my company, particularly the CIA Operation Still Point, given I had set the program up and had the full sort of support of the federal Australian government. But Robert Gray was an investor in Hellenetics. It was the SDI, Star Wars program, that would give NATO and the US superiority to shoot down all nuclear missiles fired by the Soviet Union. But he represented BIC, EastCo, Consultants International, in business relationships with all the same people: Ed Wilson, Ted Shackley, Richard Secord, Eric von Barbod, Thomas Kleins and Michael Ledeen. Interesting that Michael Ledeen keeps popping up. Let's have a look at his expertise. My research shows the PROMIS software was used for the Strategic Defence Initiative Star Wars program with AWACS, NSA Echelon spy satellites for NATO's nuclear missile defence system for tracking Soviet nuclear submarines. That is confirmed categorically by Michael Riconosciuto in his testimony in court. NATO was the first client for the PROMIS software. I've interviewed Michael extensively and he confirms that the PROMIS software was used for the simulation of nuclear war operations throughout Europe for NATO, for all their operations and drills preparing for nuclear war. Also, Exonix Inc. had a common directors. There was Edward Taylor, Bernard Katz, Earl Bryan and Dominic Leahy that developed X-ray technology and sonar towing submarine tracking systems for the US Navy. So this is overlapping with the need for the PROMIS software. Also, Hadron Inc. had common directors, Earl Bryan, Dominic Leahy and Charles Missler. And they developed the command control systems for the AWACS systems, for the Saudi air defence and NATO, and also for the Trident submarines. Let's have a look of the time frame. Charles Missler was appointed by as the chairman and CEO of Hellenetics Inc. with directors Edward Taylor, Bernard Katz, William Simon, but also Admiral Thomas B. Hayward, Chief of Naval Operations, and General David C. Jones, Chairman of Joint of Staff, and Robert Gray & Co. as an investor. Robert Gray was the investor of the CIA DIA Safe software. It was renamed the Iris Swift Banking software. It was developed by Hadron, Simcom Inc., Wang Labs and Computer Power Group, owned by Rupert Murdoch. Robert Gray was also director of Eastco and consultants with Ed Wilson, Shackley, Secord, Marbod and Michael Ledeen, and Thomas Clines, by the way. And Robert Gray and William Casey employed CIA agent Robert Sensi, working for Kuwait royal family, to organise the Iran-Contra BCI checks paid to Adnan Khashoggi and manager Gorbanafar, held by Danny Casolaro. He was also CEO of Knowlton and Hill and represented the Kuwait royal family, BCCI and the Nicaraguan resistance. Let's have a look at his complete profile. For him to make those statements about the Rothschild banks and the fear of the Freemasons as a secret society hell-bent on a world government and links with satanic belief systems. Is he just making these things up, or does he really know what they're doing? If you have a look at his resume, it's outstanding. Cybernetics Corporation, 1968 to 1970. He set up the Computer Network Company by ADP. He then was a director of Pertec Computer Corporation, which was acquired by Triumph Adler, Germany. He then was a director of Applied Devices Corporation, support service of international oil industry and state lotteries. He then became chairman of the board and chief executive officer of Precision Instruments Co. in 1975 to 77, advanced laser memory development for the National Security Agency. You'll find that this man is a genius he actually developed the DES encryption silicon chips required by NSA for all encryption. He then was appointed as a director from 1979 to 1981 of Hadron Inc., Director of Advanced Developments Defence Industry. He then was appointed also as the chairman of the board and chief executive officer of Western Digital Corporation, manufacturer of semiconductor discs worldwide. This man is a genius. He then was a director of Datum Inc., manufactures computer peripherals, particularly the cesium clocks for the global positioning satellite systems. And then appointed as chairman of the board and chief executive officer of Helenetics. He was asked by William E. Simon, former Secretary Treasury, asked him to join on his strategically sensitive ultraviolet laser project. Now, this ultraviolet laser project was to allow them to communicate with submarines and also for taking out missiles. And I'll elaborate on that a bit more later using an X-ray gun. Asked me to join him in strategic sensitive ultra laser project. We both resigned after a futile 13 months boardroom struggle with Bernard Katz. He then was director of Ducommun Inc., Asset Relocation, oldest corporation in California, aerospace, metals processing, electronic distribution. He then became chairman of the board of Resdal Industries and chief executive officer. And they had contracts with the Department of Defense on deeply classified customers, partnered with Boeing on the P-3 upgrade, the AWACS systems, and the Northrop on the stealth bomber. As you can see, his expertise in technologies, inventions, in Echelon, and also AWACS and submarines and missile systems is incredible. So he knows what the SDI, Star Wars program, is trying to do, because that's why they appointed him as the chairman and CEO. In 1989, the Phoenix Group Inc., Chuck Missler's publicly traded development company, entered into an $8 billion joint venture to supply personal computers to over 143,000 public schools of the Soviet Union. Now that is an incredible resume. He's not your average Christian evangelist. He's the man who knows what PROMIS is all about. For the Star Wars program, for banking to bankrupt the Soviet Union, and for tracking all nuclear missiles of the Soviet Union. So his books he left. He walked away. He became horrified and concerned about those people who are in power in the US, and he left the US and lived in New Zealand and released his documentary books on the Book of Daniel, the Book of Revelation, the Black Horse, and Europa Rising, and the New World Order. Program for Global Governance. It's clear that he could see who the power was and what they're doing. And so in his book, The Black Horse, he details meticulously the history of the Rothschilds setting up the Federal Reserve Bank, expressing serious concerns about secret meeting on an island. Sounds like the stuff of conspiracy and legend, and it would be easy to dismiss except for the large numbers of documents confirming the meeting indeed took place. On Jekyll Island, in November 1910, after having consulted with Rothschild's Bank in England, France and Germany, Senate Whip Nelson W. Aldrich boarded a private train in Hoboken, New Jersey, with his final destination as Jekyll Island off the coast of Georgia, a private hunting club owned by powerful banker and corporate financier J.P. Morgan. He then details that those present included Benjamin Strong from the J.P. Morgan's Bank Trust Company, Morgan's First National Bank, York, J.P. Morgan Company, National City Bank in New York, that became Citibank, and also Paul Walsberg, a member of the influential German banking family who had settled in the United States as a partner in a great investment bank, Kuhn, Loeb and Company. Walsberg represented the Rothschilds in England and France. He says many years later, Van Slip would describe the meeting in Saturday Evening Post. There was an occasion near the close of 1910 when I was as secretive, indeed as furtive, as any conspirator. I do not feel it is any exaggeration to speak of our secret exhibition to Jekyll Island as the occasion of actual conception of what eventually became the Federal Reserve System, founded and created in secrecy. His chapter is written on the engines of power, and he confirms in 1744 Mayer Amskel Rothschild was born in a Jewish ghetto of Frankfurt, Holy Roman Empire, and talks about the 5 Rothschild sons formed banking houses in London, Paris, Vienna, Naples and Frankfurt. In March 1815, Napoleon returned to France, and the Rothschilds anticipated another of Napoleon's long drawn-out wars. They quickly brought up gold in preparation to loan the Duke of Wellington money to fight the Emperor, but Napoleon's forces fell at Waterloo in June, just 3 months later. The war was over quickly, and the Rothschilds were dismally sitting on piles of gold that promised to drop in value as peace reigned. So Nathan Rothschild thought quickly and made a massive gamble. He believed the British government bond values would rise in the absence of war, so he began putting the gold into bonds. So this is the part where NF Rothschild and Son in London was responsible for stabilising the world currencies, and the banking family made a great deal of money in the process. Many people do not understand, but NM Rothschilds and Sons financed Rupert Murdoch's company Computer Power Group, which acquired the PROMIS software from Inslaw Inc. NM Rothschilds and Son every Monday morning would set the gold bullion prices worldwide. So their interest in PROMIS software being acquired by Rupert Murdoch and Inslaw Inc., who are developing the PROMIS software, it is known to them through their links with MI5, CIA, of the importance of the PROMIS software. He goes on to talk about money makes more money and money is power in the world. The larger the Rothschilds grew, the easier their opportunities to gain access to all governments and the thrones of Europe. In the 20th century, the Nazis declared the Rothschilds guilty of manipulating stock market news, so obviously this was of concern when Hitler was coming to power. He states the Federal Reserve masquerades as a government agency, but it's not. It's an engine that has created unimaginable private wealth to private banking cartel. It has enabled an imperial elite to manipulate our economy for its own agenda while making the federal government its personal enforcer. Through the Federal Reserve, this elite group regularly dictates the financial parameters used by our businesses, our homes, and practically everything in which we're interested. The election of 1912, Colonel Edward Mandell House worked behind the scenes in the election of 1912 to get Woodrow Wilson into office. The son of Thomas House, Colonel House, represented the interests of the Rothschild banks and was originally a member of the Institute of International Affairs, formed in Paris at the Majestic Hotel in a secret meeting on May 30, 1999. Its American branch, formed in July 29, 19, became the Council on Foreign Relations, the CFR. And he states now the Federal Reserve is nothing more than a group of private banks which charge interest on money that never existed. The government prints $1 billion worth of interest-bearing US government bonds and takes them to the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve accepts them and places $1 billion in a checking account, and the government writes checks to the total of $1 billion. Where was that $1 billion before they touched the computer to make the entry? It didn't exist. We allowed this private banking system to create money out of absolutely nothing. Call it a loan to our government and a charge interest on it forever. The bank collects the interest on the government's own money. Of course, this is a summary of a highly complex system, but that's really what's going on. I believe that he can see what the cartel has been doing from the beginning. He then talks about the Bretton Woods Agreement and the New Hampshire, officially called the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference, and it referred simply as the Bretton Woods Conference. Two international agencies were created at this meeting, the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and its sister organisation, the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, commonly known as the World Bank. He then describes in intimate detail the World Bank and IMF and announced the purposes of these organisations were admirable, The World Bank was to make loans to worn, torn and undeveloped nations so they could build stronger economies. The IMF was to promote monetary cooperation between nations by maintaining fixed exchange rates between their currencies. But the method for which these goals were to be achieved was less than admirable. It was to terminate the use of gold as the basis of international currency exchange and replace it with a politically manipulated paper standard. This would allow governments to escape the discipline of gold so they could create paper money out of nothing, without paying the penalty of having their currencies dropping in value on the world markets. Prior to the conference, currencies were exchanged in terms of their gold value, and the arrangement was called the Gold Exchange Standard. This is not the same as gold standard. It means their values were set by supply and demand and realistically reflected their increasing or decreasing value. Politicians and bankers absolutely hated the arrangement because it was beyond their ability to manipulate money. And so, without going much more, it's talking about the IMF appears to be part of United Nations, much as the Federal Reserve System appears to be part of United States government. In reality, it's entirely independent, funded on quotas by its member nations, almost 200 in number. The greatest share of this capital comes from the more highly industrialised nations, Great Britain, Japan, France and Germany. One of the routine operations of the IMF is to exchange worthless currencies for dollars so that weaker countries can pay their international bills. This is supposed to cover temporary cash flow problems. It is like an international FDIC which rushes money to a country that has gone bankrupt so it can avoid devaluing its currency. These transactions are almost never paid back. Michael testified, and Danny CASOLARO is holding documents, and I have them as well and have done research on this, but he confirmed that a group called Coral and Johnson, CIA and US Treasury with NSA were setting up a secret Treasury computer system with SCT using the PROMIS software, and it was to prevent the least developing countries' banking systems collapsing. This was covered in the Inslaw case and evidence as well, but I have researched this and found all the directives and have found definitive links to a Swiss trust fund with a doctor in Switzerland living in Florida who was a personal friend of Alexander Haig. I thought I'd mention that to you, is that the PROMIS software was planned to be used for setting up a secret treasury computer system for preventing the collapse, using the PROMIS software to prevent the collapse of the least developing countries, particularly Brazil, which was facing bankruptcy at the time. This is consistent with the concerns being raised by Christian evangelist Chuck Missler, who was the chairman and CEO of Hellenetics, the SDI Star Wars program. In 1970, IMF created a new monetary unit called SDR, Special Drawing Right, and he goes on and confirms they are not money but rather promises of governments to get the money by taxing their own citizens, should the need arise. Don't you like that? Special drawings, the media optimistically describe them as paper gold. But they're not money, it's rather promises made by governments to get the money by taxing their own citizens. The IMF considers these their assets, which become the reserves from which loans are made to other governments. The original purpose of IMF was to maintain fixed rates of exchange between world currencies, but the IMF has presided over more than 200 currency devaluations. A failure of that magnitude would be cause for going out of business in private sector, but not in global politics. The greater the failure, the greater the pressure to expand the program. When the dollar broke loose from gold and was no longer a standard for measuring currency values, the IMF merrily changed its goals and continued to expand its operation. The new goal was to overcome trade deficits. He then goes on to talk about that in June 4th, 1963, President Kennedy issued his famous executive order 11110, which said, May 12, 1933, as to silver certificates against any silver bullion, silver or standard silver dollars in the Treasury, not then held for redemption of any outstanding silver certificates, to prescribe the denominations of such silver certificates, and to coin standard silver dollars and subsidiary silver currencies for the redemption, and B, by revoking subparagraphs B and C of paragraph 2 thereof. Now that's quite a mouthful. This order gives the President alone the authority to issue silver certificates, removing that authority from the Secretary of Treasury. President Kennedy did authorise the printing of over $4 billion in United States notes, and some of those bills can still be found. They were issued, however, at United States notes, quote, legal tender, like the greenbacks that President Lincoln issued during the Civil War, and they were distinguished by a red seal rather than the blue seal of silver certificates or the green seal of the Federal Reserve notes. Above the presidential portrait appears the word United States note, rather than silver certificate or Federal Reserve note. Both $2 and $5 notes were printed in 1963, and these United States notes were also not interest-bearing debt, like Federal Reserve notes. He then goes on to say in his book, Mars concluded, many assassination researchers feel it was not a mere coincidence that Lincoln and Kennedy, the only two US presidents who attempted to issue interest-free money, were both shot in the head in public. Interesting observation. Anyone familiar with Kennedy assassination recognises right away the professionalism involved. The matter should shock us in the high-level coordination and organised cover-up. The Warren Commission's shoddy investigation manifests how widespread it was, giving the strong evidence of a hidden power manipulating from behind the scenes. The cover-up is more astonishing than the assassination itself. It was so skillful and pervasive that even in this day, few Americans realize that a coup d'etat was engineered that day in Dealey Plaza. So, he goes on to raise further concerns. There's an elite core in the country that has dominated American society. The Trilateral Commission, the Council of Foreign Relations. Their objective is to try to bring about a gradual transition in our society, a dissolving of sovereignty, and a moving steadily to the left on the political spectrum. You are looking at a group that has worked to bring about the dissolution of national sovereignty on the road to world government. And I thought these were very interesting additions that he says. And this is from Chuck Missler, a director of Hadron, chairman and CEO of Hellenetics, Inc., the official SDI and Star Wars program. McDonald's efforts ended 3 months later on August 31, 1983, when Korean Airlines 007 was shot down after it strayed into Soviet airspace. That was a strange coincidence. Senator John Hines III and Senator John Tower had served on powerful banking and finance committees and were outspoken critics of the Federal Reserve and the Eastern establishment. On the 4th of April 1991, Senator John Hines was killed in a plane crash near Philadelphia. The next day, on August 5th, former Senator John Tower was also killed in a plane crash. The coincidence seemed to mount. So this is coming from Dr. Chuck Missler. Even he draws parallels of coincidences. Senator John Tower was also president of Pergamon Press, owned by Robert Maxwell, who had the PROMIS software as a dual MI6 and Mossad spy. The concentration of power in America is frightening. Quote from Otto von Habsburg. Now this is the part of his story where I find it hard to believe is a coincidence. He says here, Thomas Jefferson wrote a letter to John Taylor on May 28, 1816, saying, "And I sincerely believe with you that banking establishments are more dangerous than standing armies, and that the principle of spending money to be paid by posterity under the name of funding is but swindling futurity on a large scale." That's when I reflect on what Otto von Habsburg tried to tell me. The concentration of power in America is frightening. Now this is Dr. Chuck Missler. He met with Otto von Habsburg during his travels, and Otto von Habsburg said to him, "The concentration of power in America is frightening." He says here, for many years numerous authors have attempted to sound the alarm that there exists a hidden shadow government that actually rules America. Most of us have dismissed these conspiracy views as extremist and unrealistic. I had the opportunity to have lunch with Otto von Habsburg, whose father ruled Europe until the end of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire in 1918. When I ate lunch with him, he was serving as a member of the European Parliament, and he made two remarks that really caught my attention. I truly understood his first remark. He said, "The ignorance in America is overwhelming." And indeed he was correct. Anybody who pays attention to world affairs realizes there's a great contrast between the general awareness of the average American and the average European. It's quite striking. When I had an office in London, the staff there was more aware of what's going on in California than our own staff in California. Americans are surprisingly ignorant when it comes to important international issues. And Dr. Chuck Missler then says, the second remark that Otto von Habsburg made, however, really puzzled me at the time. He said, "The concentration of power in America is frightening." He says, "Now I was the chief executive. I'd spent 30 years in the corporate boardrooms. I thought I was reasonably well informed, and I didn't know what on earth he meant when he said it. Later I began to realize the massive amount of power in the money interests, the global elite who reside in the highest places of power in our land and exercise their will without any apparent impunity. That's an amazing statement being made by Dr. Chuck Missler, the director of Hadron, involved in the theft of the PROMIS software and the exploitation on Trident submarines for tracking nuclear missiles, and appointed as the chairman and CEO of Hellenetics Inc. SDI Star Wars programs with William Simon, Edward Teller, and Robert Gray. So who was Otto van Habsburg? He was the last Crown Prince of Austria-Hungary in 1916 until the dissolution of the Empire in November 1918. In 1922, he became the pretender to the former thrones, head of the House of the Habsburg-Lorraine, and sovereign of the Order of the Golden Fleece upon the death of his father. Otto was active on the Austrian European political stage from 1930s, both promoting the cause of Habsburg restoration and as early proponent of the European integration, being thoroughly disgusted with nationalism and a fierce opponent of Nazism and communism. He had been described as one of the leaders of Austrian resistance after 1938 Anschluss. He was sentenced to death by the Nazis and fled Europe to the United States. Otto van Habsburg was Vice President and President of the International Pan-European Union and served as a member of the European Parliament for the Christian Social Union of Bavaria, CSU, from 1979 to 1999. As a newly elected member of European Parliament in 1979, Otto had an empty chair set up for the countries on the other side of the Iron Curtain in the European Parliament and took a strong interest in the countries behind the Iron Curtain. Otto has been described as one of the architects of the European idea and of European integration, together with Robert Schuman, Konrad Adenauer, and Alcide de Gasperi. But this is the part that's now important. Otto van Habsburg was also known as Archduke Otto of Austria, was a deep politician. Joel van der Regen's four-establishment model places Otto van Habsburg at the centre of the Vatican Pan-Europa network, bracket, the Catholic conservative establishment running Opus Dei and the Knights of Malta, an indispensable ally of the CIA during the Cold War and beyond. In 1949, he founded the European Documentation and Information Centre together with Alfred Sanchez Bella. So there you go. Otto van Habsburg was running Opus Dei and the Knights of Malta, an indispensable ally of the CIA. It shows that he was participating in the Circle in 1970, attended the meeting in Washington, D.C., the Rockefeller family mansion. And then again he appeared at Le Cercle in 1984 in Bonn. Held in Bonn, West Germany, the list of 36 visitors was published online in 2011. I will show you now the importance of Le Cercle 6i. It really has been set up, including a number of members of the Catholic Opus Dei and the Knights of Malta. And it is a right-wing society of dignitaries. I've covered this already, but it's definitely got links with WACL, the World Anti-Communist League, with Richard Singlaub, Ted Shackley, but the key members who became the chairman was MI6 officer Anthony Cavendish and British conservative Julian Amory and Brian Crozier, and it was being financed by the CIA. And so in the membership and meetings that were being held in 1985 in Washington, President Ted Shackley, Herbert Mayer, appointed by William Casey for CIA's economic warfare program, James Critchfield, CIA agent tasked with gathering information about the Soviet Union from Reinhard Gehlen and his Gehlen organization. He also was mentor to Ted Shackley. Norman Bailey, responsible for economic warfare for NSC, and he met with William Hamilton and confirmed the PROMIS software was used by NSA for the follow the money program at all banks. Rolf Garage, German arms dealer, business partner of Ed Wilson with ESCO. Richard Stilwell, working with Colonel Albert V. Carone. I've interviewed Ferdinand Carone, and Dee Ferdinand, and the daughter of Albert Carone, and she has confirmed categorically that Richard Stilwell was known to her father and was directly involved with the Nugan Bank, and her father had links with the Gambino Mafia, and was personal friends with William Colby and William Casey, who visited their house regularly on a monthly basis. And also present is Donald Jamison, CIA agent and also Director of Research Associates with Ted Shackley. So you can see that this entity is linked with Ted Shackley's crew and the CIA team involved in economic warfare with William Casey. Confirming from registrations I've already got, but Julian Amory is a director of Atlantic Circle with Ted Shackley as the president. Most important is the links of the groups that are politically tied up with them. The Circle Complex, or 6I, has interlocked with the whole panoply of international right-wing groups. The Pan-European Union by Otto van Habsburg, European Movement, CDI, Bilderberg Group, WACL, Opus Dei, the Moonies, Western Goals, set up by Richard Singlaub, and the Heritage Foundation. The prominent politicians were Circle Pinay, Antonin Pinay, Konrad Adenauer, Archduke Otto van Habsburg, Franz Joseph Strauss, to name a few, and includes Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. This part is important, but back in 1969-70, documents and meeting notes and telephone transcripts of Henry Kissinger include records prepared for Kissinger of the debate at 1970 Circle meeting. The memorandum kindly provided is reproduced in a new annex bringing together authors' research on post-war Christian groups, CIOC and CIDCC, involve Pinay, Violet, Dubras. The most intriguing document from the period is a secret memorandum from Kissinger to Nixon with an attached CIA report which detail involvement of Pesenti and Violet in a hereto unknown, wait for it, covert Catholic group known as Sint Unum, as described by Alice Arjuni, formerly of the University of Florence, whose research paper is included in an annex with permission with thanks. And that's in the book Rogue Agents, Habsburg, Pinay, and the Private Cold War from 1951 to 1991 by David Teacher. It confirms that there was regular appearance of State Department cables, central foreign policy files from 1973 to 78, which provided much detail about several Circle members. Circle meeting held in November 1977, coordinated by Donald Jamison, Director of Research Associates with Ted Shackley, and confirms that present was David Rockefeller, Henry Kissinger, Zbigniew Brzezinski, Harold Brown, George Meany, Lane Kirkland of the AFL-CIO, and attended Treasury by W. Michael Blumenthal and William Colby, when Director, retired previously as Director of CIA. 7. Kramer's father had been a long-withstanding Washington insider. The German-born Fritz G. A. Kramer was senior legal advisor to the League of Nations. A gifted talent scout and teacher in 1944, he discovered the young Henry Kissinger, who joined his division in 1944. In 1961, he also discovered Alexander Haig, and in 1969 recommended him as the military assistant to the National Security Advisor, Henry Kissinger. His son, Sven Kramer, also served the Nixon-Kissinger National Security Council. Senior civilian advisor to the US Army Chief of Staff in the Pentagon, and influenced the Department of Defense during the Cold War. During his time at Pentagon, he was influenced Secretaries of Defense James R. Schlesinger, Donald Rumsfeld. When Kramer died in September 8, 2003, he was buried with full military honours in Arlington National Cemetery. He was honoured by former Secretary of Defense James R. Schlesinger and his former students Henry Kissinger and Alexander Haig. So we really do have a very direct link with all the parties in the secret team linked to former German Nazis. Another Bilderberger and crucial political figure was Zbigniew Brzezinski, who has proposed the 1972 Bilderberg Conference in setting up a three economic world powers, the US, Europe and Japan. The new body, the Trilateral Commission, was founded in late 1972. Its first director of 1973 to 76 was Brzezinski. So we really do have all of the high-hitting, far-right extremists linked with the secret team of Kissinger, William Casey, Ted Shackley's team. The most important thing is in 1978, the Circle complex would also seek funding from multinational companies for Brian Crozier's recently founded private intelligence service called the 6I. In June 1977, NATO and the Global Threat Conference, What Must Be Done, which aimed to raise private sector funds to supplement the activities of official agencies that have been crippled after the earlier US congressional committees and the official closure of Britain's IR&D in spring 1977. So this appears that given the Church Committee and the discovery that CIA has been spying on civilians and also involved in assassination of foreign leaders, it turns out that the 6I is forming, looking and being financed privately. It says here the Circle/6I also created several new British groups specialising in, wait for it, anti-disarmament propaganda, thanks to the American funding from three main sources, of which the first was the CIA. And in his memoirs, Crozier records that after initial hesitation, Reagan's Director of Central Intelligence, William Casey, provided £50,000 in 1981 and $100,000 in 1982. Brian Crozier records that the name of the sixth international, known as 6I, following the five communists or Trotskyist internationals, was suggested some months later by a distinguished Argentine associate of ours, a former justice minister named Jacques Chirac. The task of the 6I, wait for it, would rather be in the field of intelligence gathering, psychological warfare, and covert funding. This is the beginning of 77 and 78, where Ted Shackley, William Casey, and his team are realising that they're setting up the 6I as private covert funded psychological warfare and intelligence gathering on American soil. Crozier summarises the task of 6I as follows: to provide reliable intelligence in areas which governments were barred from investigating. There it is, clear as mud. To provide reliable intelligence in areas which governments were barred from investigating, either through recent legislation as in the US, or because political circumstances made such inquiries difficult or potentially embarrassing. To conduct secret counter-subversion operations in any country in which such actions were deemed feasible. Goes on to say that the future role of the 6I in circumventing domestic restrictions on intelligence operations and in coordinating private sector counter-subversion efforts is stressed by Crozier. We planned both to initiate secret operations in our various countries and to coordinate the existing overt actions of many private groups involved in the resistance to the Soviet propaganda and active measures. Unlike existing agencies, we would not be hampered by prohibitions on functioning in our own or allied countries. And that summarises Ted Shackley's secret team. I also found in the book General Robert Close would go on to be a central figure in 1980s 6I propaganda campaign against the nuclear disarmament movement. Detailed below, he would also serve as the world president of WACL from 1983 to 1984, Vice President General Political Affairs Committee of the Western European Union, and from 1986 on, the President of Western Goals Belgium and Frequent Resistance International Signatory. In my interviews with Michael Reconnosciuto, he mentioned that he was working at times for the Western Goals Foundation, which was set up by John Singlaub. It says here clearly the British peace movement was therefore the primary 6I target, and between 1979 and 1987, CND was subjected to unprecedented propaganda and a harassment campaign run by an alliance of three complexes. Firstly, several private sector groups closely linked to Circle Pinay, the 6I, and their backers in the Heritage Foundation. Secondly, DS 19, Defence Secretariat 19, an official but covert anti-CND propaganda unit within the Ministry of Defence, and last but certainly not least, MI5's internal subversion division known as the F branch. Major private sector funding for Circle 6I campaigns would also be provided by the American Foundation, whose president since 1977, Edwin Fulner, had attended the December 1979 Circle meeting. The Heritage Foundation, whose role is concealed in Crozier's memoirs, provided the infrastructure and funding for 3 Circle 6I groups active in anti-peace movement propaganda in Britain. While some of the funding was direct and therefore public, the Heritage Foundation also created an intermediary to act as a conduit for covert funding for the Circle/6I campaign. The International Freedom Fund establishment, which was run by Brian Crozier, who thus became the Heritage Foundation's bagman in Britain. It goes to show IRS tax returns from the Heritage Foundation show it donated a total of $140,000 during the 3 years 1982, 83 and 85. And it's got down here, Crozier another $50,000 in 1986, and he also conceded that it got a total of £200,000 from the Heritage Foundation between 1982 and 1986. And now we get the details of other members. Another regular Crozier partner and possible 6I founding member was Richard Pearl, nicknamed the Prince of Darkness and named by Grossman in 2014 as a Circle member. So this makes sense why William Hamilton calls me to say that he's received advice from a mysterious Pentagon spy, that he has discovered that Paul Wolfowitz is leading the efforts of Richard Pearl, Douglas Faith and Scooter Libby to shut down my research into the PROMIS software. It says here Pearl worked from 1969 to 1980 as a senior staff member for Senator Henry Scoop Jackson, a prominent member of the Senate Armed Services Committee, leading opponent of the SALT II Treaty. Whilst with Jackson, Pearl ensured a massive expansion of the US military aid to Israel. Aided by Pearl, Jackson quickly became Israel's #1 man in Congress, constantly pushing for more and more money. In fiscal years 1970, Israel received military credits from the United States worth $30 million, but thanks to Jackson's amendment the next year, an amount skyrocketed to $545 million, and by 1974 it had reached an extraordinary $2.2 billion, more than 70 times what it had just been 4 years earlier. It summarizes that Kramer, Pearl, Faith, de Graaf and Reed would work together over the next 20 years to become notorious figures in Rumsfeld's Pentagon from 2001 on. Other Crozier allies within Reagan's NSC were Sovietologist and NSC advisors Richard Pipes, a USC ISC member, and last but certainly not least, Colonel Oliver North of the Iran-Contra fame. And so my book on PROMIS software affair leading to the 6I has been validated through this research, identifying Ted Shackley, Richard Pearl, Douglas Faith, Robert Gray, Henry Kissinger, Alexander Haig, and substantiates the threats being made against me by Robert Booth Nichols that I'm upsetting some very powerful Israeli businessmen. And so you can go on to read, but the most important thing that comes out in the Rogue Agents, called Habsburg, Pinay and the Private Cold War by David Teacher, is that it says here, while 6I launched truly global operations in Latin America and in Iran in the late 1979. So this is where Ted Shackley with Le Cercle and 6I is involved to assist the Shah with propaganda. It says here, once Margaret Thatcher had won the general election in Britain in May 1979, the next priority was the 1980 election for the West German Chancellor, where Cercle co-founder Franz Joseph Strauss was standing as a candidate. It says here, the reports also detailed the high-level support Crozier could count on. Amongst those named in the Langemann papers were two serving intelligence chiefs, Sir Arthur Dickey Franks, chief of MI6 from 1978 to 1981, and the Comanche Alexander de Marinich, director of SDECE from 1970 to 1981. Langemann's reports also revealed that one of the major goals of the 6I was to shape the future decade by supporting three key right-wing election candidates in 1979 through 1980. They were Margaret Thatcher in Britain, Franz Joseph Strauss in Germany, and Ronald Reagan in America. And now we come across to the role of Ted Shackley, October Surprise, and Iran. And it says, in early November, the Shah finally decided to give the go-ahead for Cercle to intervene. And the top civilian in SAVAK flew to London, spent a full week closeted with Robert Moss, transforming a pile of SAVAK reports on communist influence in the revolution into an ISC conflict study. Following publication of Moss's conflict study, the campaign to destabilise Iran in November 1978, the Shah authorised a first annual payment of £1 million to the 6I for a psychological action operation. But the decision to involve the 6I further would come too late, as the Shah would be overthrown in January 1979 before the payment could be made. So this is definitive evidence independently of the involvement of Ted Shackley's team with 6I in the October surprise operations with the Shah. The exiled Shah's death in July 1980 would not, however, end the 6I's interest in Iran. Crozier felt that there remained at least a fighting chance of a coup to overthrow Ayatollah Khomeini's fledgling regime. The outbreak of the Iraq-Iran war encouraged this view. Crozier therefore flew 3 times to Cairo between July and November 1980 to meet with the Shah's widow and President Sadat. But nothing would come of these meetings apart from a 6I report circulated to both Mrs. Thatcher and President Reagan. The 6I's American outreach. A major transatlantic relay in the propaganda chorus was, of course, the NSIC, who in 1979 created the Consortium for the Study of Intelligence to organise a series of conferences in Washington whose proceedings published the NSIC as the series Intelligence Requirements for 1980s would have considerable influence on the defence policy of the Reagan administration. The conferences brought together many of American allies of Cercle/6I, most of whom we've already met. So the report confirms that from the 1970s on, the dissident veterans of the Anglo-American intelligence community attending Le Cercle, rogue agents, notably ex-MI6 CIA operatives Crozier, Ted Shackley, Donald Jamison, all prominent figures, indeed co-organisers of the circle of the 1970s and 1980s. So Ted Shackley and Donald Jamison are intimately involved in the 6i and the circle from the 1970s. Other circle members, well-documented intelligence links are across a Belgian entrepreneur, Sir Stephen Hastings, a Conservative MP, the ex-MI6 initiator of Thatcher's counter-subversion outfit called SHIELD, General Richard Stilwell, as a former commander of the US and UN forces in Korea, and ex-CIA Pentagon official, overhaul US Special Forces at the time, joined the Le Circle and the 6i Politburo. So General Richard Stilwell is a critical player in both the Circle, 6i Politburo with Ted Shackley and Donald Jamison. And it states here the 6i itself, the, quote, private sector operational intelligence agency, founded by the core Le Circle trio of Crozier, Hyun and Violet, is again misnamed the 6-1 and mentioned only in passing. The American delegation attending the Circle meetings between 1982 and 85, a reflection of that since the arrival of Rockefeller, Kissinger and Nixon in the Circle in the late 1960s. So the involvement of Rockefeller, Kissinger and Nixon in the Circle started in the 1960s, had been held once a year in Washington. And it says here, unsurprisingly, the most regular American attendee was Donald Jamison, the Le Circle's transatlantic coordinator since 1977 and a 6i Politburo member, who attended the Circle meetings between June 1982 to February 1985 and Bonn in July 1984. At various Le Circle meetings he would be accompanied by senior members of the Reagan administration, Congress and American military. The second 6i Politburo member mentioned was Donald Jamison, from 1951 on, a 20-year veteran of CIA's Directorate Operations, headed the branch in charge of Soviet bloc. Jamison's branch encouraged dissidents behind the Iron Curtain, debriefed defectors and helped smuggle banned books to and from the Soviet Union and its satellite countries. Jamison had first debriefed Gotz Litzen, the defector who confirmed the fears of ultras within the CIA, MI6, MI5 about Soviet penetration of the Western governments and intelligence service, installing the CIA, MI6 and MI5 in fruitless and highly destructive mole hunts. Skeptical of Gottslin's claims and wary of the high-level attention to the Soviet defector was being paid, Jamison recommended caution. He was, however, overridden by Angleton, who removed Jamison as Gottslin's debriefer. After retiring from the CIA in 1973, Jamison had set up private defector reception group, the Jamestown Foundation, serving as its vice president. From at least 1977 on, Jamison would be the organiser of the once-yearly Circle meetings in Washington, D.C. Besides this, Jamison worked for 1980 to 1987 as vice president of Research Associates International Limited, a Washington-based risk assessment consultancy set up in 1979 by veteran CIA covert operator Theodore Shackley, who would himself be a core Le Circle member as described below. Jamison also worked for General Graham, Romerstein and Klein as an advisor to the Nathan Hale Institute run by W. Raymond Wannell, the long-standing head of FBI's Intelligence Division until his retirement with the rank of Assistant Director in 1976. Also, other mentioned members who have attended 30th November to the 1st of November, the Circle meetings in 1979 was Richard V. Allen, an advisor to Governor Reagan and a 6I contact, Barnett Traeger, and Godson of NSIC. Klein, Senate Intelligence Committee staff member, William Colby, Fred Eichel, Sven Kramer, Michael Ledeen, Richard Pipes, and Paul Wolfowitz. So we now have the complete link of Wolfowitz, Michael Ledeen. We've got Richard Pearl, Douglas Faith, Ted Shackley, James Jamieson, Donald Jamieson, are all members of the Circle and linked with the 6I. Hence the warning that I received from Robert Booth Nichols coming to Australia in December 2004. It says in 26th of April 1980, we've got Klein, and also we've got Pipes, and we've got Ted Shackley attending. And again, December 1981, Klein's and Ted Shackley and Pipes also attending the Circle meetings. There was a fourth conference in 1983, again Ted Shackley of Research Associates International, General Richard Stilwell. Also it says Tanham of the RAND Corporation. Now the part of RAND is very important, and I'll discuss that. And also Major Oliver North attended. The fifth meeting of Intelligence and Policy, we've got Kramer, Cordmeyer and Ted Shackley and Pipes appearing. And it's consistent through here that the Circle would best show the level of contacts within the Reagan administration, Department of Defense, Intelligence Community and National Security Council. The most senior Circle attendees of the Pentagon was Fred C. Eichel, and Under Secretary of Defense was the 6I's General Richard Stilwell. And RAND Corporation ports were being provided from 1957 to 1971. Eichel had met Nixon at Harvard. Kissinger appointed him Director of Arms Control Department, and he filled the post with President Nixon and Ford until 1977. Eichel was coordinator of the team advisors to Government Reagan, and Reagan as Under Secretary, and Reagan signed Eichel's proposal to arm the Afghan Mujahideen with Stinger anti-aircraft missiles. 1986. So the Eichel-Stilwell team with Richard Pearl, William Schneider Jr. also attending the Circle meetings from 1982 to 1986. And of course, confirmation here, 1985, Herbert E. Mayer, economist and associate director, brought into the CIA by William Casey, special assistant vice chairman, CIA's National Intelligence Council, the body which manages national intelligence estimates. And I think we just keep going from 1966 to members of the RAND Corporation, the Nixon and Ford administration with Menges. So Constantine C. Menges, at the time meeting National Security Council. He worked for CIA and NSC. It's got here that Mr. Menges was recruited by new CIA Director William Casey in May 1981 to be the National Intelligence Officer for Latin America. Just before joining CIA, Menges proposed the US government establish a National Foundation for Democracy to promote democratic movements in countries under communism and other forms of tyranny. President Reagan embraced the idea and 2 years later convinced Congress to fund the National Endowment for Democracy, NED. And of course, Menges is pushing ahead with restored democracy in Grenada, and it was part of a Grenada mission under Ronald Reagan. And after leaving the NSC, Menges would become resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, and fellow of Circle member Richard Pearl on the purpose of American power. Herb Mayer, Michael Ledeen, who spoke at the seminar, the role of intelligence in a free society. And I think that will probably, if we go through here, the main names now coming out in this report is Sveven Kramer was also Program Director of Barnett's NSIC, a consortium for the study of intelligence created in 1979 and involved several of Circle's American members. Richard V. Allen, William Colby, Fred Eichel, Donald Jamison, Ted Shackley, and General Richard Stilwell. And then it's got here that fellow Circle members included Edwards and Norman Bailey as a Romerstein, de Granified, and Wala. So Norman Bailey. It's got confirms here that the economic consultant for NSC was Norman A. Bailey, whose U.S. Army service had been spent in strategic intelligence joint operational planning from 1981 to 1983. Bailey worked for Reagan's NSC, successively filling the posts of Director of Planning and Evaluation, Senior Director of National Security Planning and International Economic Affairs, Special Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs, Menges' predecessor. Bailey was central character in President Reagan's strategy to accelerate the demise of the Soviet Union and to run economic warfare against the USSR, as explained by William P. Clark, Reagan's second National Security Advisor, in his foreword to Bailey's 1998 monograph, The Strategic Plan That Won the Cold War. According to Norman Bailey, the NSA has been using its vast powers with signals intelligence to track financial transactions around the world since the early 1980s. From 1982 to 1984, Bailey ran a top-secret program for President Reagan's National Security Council called Follow the Money, that used NSA signal intelligence to track loans from Western banks to the Soviet Union and its allies. According to Bailey, the Reagan program marked a significant shift in resources from human spying to electronic surveillance as a way to track money flows to suspected criminals and American enemies. That was the beginning of the whole process, he said. And so that substantiates independently my interview with William Hamilton. He confirms categorically that he met with Norman Bailey and he had told him that NSA was using his PROMIS software for the Follow the Money program through the international banks. Another special assistant that attended the 1985 Circle meeting was Walter John Raymond, Polish-born professor, political science chairman of St. Paul's College until his retirement in 1986. Walter Raymond also served as a CIA agent in Australia during the loans affair that destroyed the Whitlam government, that was orchestrated by William Colby, Henry Kissinger, Ted Shackley, Frank Colucci, and Robert Booth Nichols. Together with Sir Harry Gillam and Eric Searcals, covered in my previous. He also was responsible for meeting with Rupert Murdoch and William Casey in terms of agreeing to finance. His memos confirm that Rupert Murdoch has agreed to fund Project Democracy for CIA, and which was part of NED, the National Endowment for Democracy Foundation. It says here also that Military Circle member USAF Lieutenant General James Allen Abrason, who from 1981 to 1984 had been seconded to NASA to run the Space Shuttle program, and he also was a director of the Strategic Defense Initiative organization set up by Reagan, in breaking the High Frontier Lobby Group run by Generals Graham and Richardson, as detailed above. Hence Helenetics with Dr. Chuck Missler, together with Robert Gray, together with Edward Teller, and also with William Simon. Another significant military figure was Admiral Thomas Maurer, Vietnam-era Chief of Naval Operations, Chairman of Joint Staff, and a member of Team B. He was also a member of ASC and Western Goals, and co-chairman of Fish and Graham Peace Through Strength, launched in August 1978, in which by 1981 could count on the support of 271 members of Congress and over 2,500 generals and admirals. From 1980 until 1989, Maurer was the director of NSIC. So, this journey is highlighting that the CIA and NSA economic warfare program used Project Link, and I'll describe that. NATO, it was installed at NATO, World Bank, IMF and international banks. It was set up by RAND Corporation, the Wharton Econometric Forecasting Associates and Stanford Research Institution, and administered and run by William Casey, Herbert Mayer, Henry Rowan, Norman Bailey. My research also confirms that PROMIS software was installed not only for Project Link, for the economic modelling of the Soviet Union and all countries worldwide, by capturing all economic databases from banks and governments worldwide. It was also used by the US Navy and NATO to track nuclear submarines, as confirmed by Michael Riconosciuto, the first client. But also, Norman Bailey has confirmed independently that CIA and NSA, their follow-the-money Swiss banking program, was installed at IMF, World Bank and international banks. And I've proven that independently with CIA Safe, the IRIS software that was headed by Robert McNamara and Edward Heath, and installed at the World Bank, IMF, and also the Club of Rome banks through Kissinger Associates and Robert Gray, who was an investor in IRIS Corporation. And it was also used for the COCOM agreement to track the sale of all Western technologies, administered by Richard Pearl, for enforcing sanctions against Soviet Union, Iraq, Iran and Libya as part of the COCOM agreements of all countries worldwide as signatories. And here is my evidence of its links with INSLAW. It turns out that the Stanford Research Institute and the Wharton Econometrics Forecast Association had prepared, it was called Phase 3 document for Volume 1, which was the economic model of the Soviet Union. Now, Stanford Research Institute was a business associate and venture partner with Rupert Murdoch's company Computer Power Group that already had Bill Hamilton's PROMIS software. And they were developing the lean software, as identified by Michael Riconosciuto in his court testimony, was CIA's PROMIS software, renamed the lean software and sold to the Australian Federal Attorney General and installed in intelligence agencies and government agencies for the monitoring of all bank transactions in Australian banks through AUSTRAC. It monitors all transactions over $10,000 and it follows the money for organised crime and drugs and money laundering. But Stanford Research Institute, together with the Wharton Econometrics Forecast Association, had developed the economic engine model for the whole Soviet Union. It involved the Project Link software models developed by Dr. Herbert S. Levine, and also, I've highlighted there, it was Project Link, which was developed by Lawrence Klein, who was Nobel Prize winner economist. It was funded by DARPA, Defence Advanced Research Projects Agency, and Michael Riconosciuto knew personally Dr. Harry Fair, who provided references for Michael Riconosciuto for his research that he was doing at Wackenhut, and also with Robert Booth Nichols with Meridian International for contracts with the Australian government for the military, which I have all the records of. So here is an overlap of DARPA with the PROMIS software for integration for economic databases being captured real time from all banks worldwide, including World Bank, IMF, and used for the modelling of economies of the world. So Project Link is an economic modelling software that was used to model and predict the economy of the Soviet Union, given that they could follow the money. I'm summarising again. It was the RAND Corporation, the Wharton Econometric Forecast Associates, Stanford Research Institute, and the evidence comes from the book From Victory, Reagan administration's secret strategy that hastened the collapse of the Soviet Union, which we know Lee Wanta with Operation Still Point was working for Herbert Mayer, William Casey and President Reagan to destroy the economy of the Soviet Union and to move out their gold bullion through Citibank and Project Hammer and other banks, particularly World Bank, US Treasury. I've covered this already, covert financial. It started with Poland, solidarity movement in Poland, psychological operations and tracking of Western high technology. I've interviewed Michael Cottrell, the business partner of Leo Wanta, and he has provided me a full copy of his thesis. And it clearly confirms the covert operations. And the title of his thesis is called Elite Power and Capital Markets by Michael C. Cottrell, dated February 13, 2002, and he's provided me with a complete copy of his thesis and confirming that William Casey worked in economic warfare. He goes through the complete operations of the elite power continuum, the power elite continuum, overt activities, deviant activities, covert activities, and anomaly activities. He has diagrams of elite power. He goes through how they manipulate the capital markets, the tools used by elite power, the role of commercial banking, the stock market, the bond market, the money markets, the paper game. He then goes on, power and the financial markets. Power and the financial markets. Elite power is access. Deviance is the lack of checks and balances. What's amazing is that as he goes through and reveals the way that the elite power uses the Federal Reserve System, the stock exchange, the banks, he then cites the key cases of Dr. Armand Hamer's companies, who was one of the directors of BCCI. He then goes through and talks about the journey of OSS to CIA in economic warfare. He goes through the creation of economic stabilization funds used by NSC and CIA and the Internal Revenue Service. He goes through the use of tracking oil and Netherlands holding company that has ties to NATO and NSC and CIA with an Iran oil trust. He goes through and describes in detail enterprise ops involving NSA, National Security Agency, with their overt and covert operations. And then he goes through in intimate detail, citing examples of how CIA was working with SAVAK, the Shah of Iran, control his armies, police force, intelligence services, and the hostages. And then he goes through in quite a bit of detail of the CIA funding the Nicaraguan, Honduras, Guatemala, Costa Rica, and then Mexico through NSC Executive Orders 12333. The role of Oliver North and the Iran-Contra scandal with Richard Secord, Albert Hakem, with the role of Director Casey, Robert McFarlane, President Bush. But the part that caught my attention is that he talks in detail about the way that the finances were being used for Poland would become an added weapon to the Reagan economic warfare operations by becoming a thorn in the side of the Soviet satellite system via the Solidarity movement. Together with Reagan, together with NATO in its roles, with William Casey to undermine the Soviet Union. And then he goes into detail about the role of the financial conduits for BCCI with CIA in the Afghan projects, Nicaraguan projects, and the banks that were involved for the movement of funds. And then the gold, which is the research that I had uncovered. In a prior podcast, I had clearly identified $250 million that was being moved by BCCI subsidiaries called Capcom Financial Services, Capcom Securities Limited, Capcom Inc., Capcom Co., Chemical Futures Inc. and Capcom Equities, Capcom Financial Services Limited, with the directors of BCCI. And their links with Pat Robertson's Christian organisation for the laundering of Noriega's drugs. These are things clearly spelt out in his thesis, given his expertise is in finance and he was the business partner of LAUNDERING for Operation Still Point. And his summary is, the elite power continuum tends to describe the interrelationships between entities, banking, politics, legislation, overt/covert activities, and the capital markets. The continuum consists of the following sets of activities: overt, deviant, covert, and anomaly. He says that overt activities are those that are open, visible to the public view, and include entities such as trusts, corporations, real estate investment trusts, real estate mortgage investment conduits, legislation and licensing. He then says that deviant activities are those that represent actions or behaviour that differ from the accepted social or moral standards. These are the most difficult to define due to the lack of single standard imposed on political arena and or financial markets. These activities have been divided into three general areas: ethics, those activities that illustrate conflicting entity behaviour; obfuscation, intentional confusion; 3. Denial, refuse to state the truth. Denial also includes three typologies of deviant activities: political-financial, that includes both overt and covert elements; Volsh Cash Act, Federal Financing Bank; AMTORG and Energy Ops; Entity Financial, the combined legal entities for illicit and illegal activities; AMTORG, Casey's Enterprise Companies. And he states clearly, the Matrix Churchill et al. And Capcom Financial Service et al. And C. White Collar Financial, that involves activities ranging from normal business and banking practice to fraud, theft, bribery, and extortion, i.e. BCCI, United Fruit Co. and Chemical New York. Covert activities are those that are concealed, hidden or secret and can be classified as deviant activities authorized by government, but without public written authorization. This element of continuum demonstrates the execution of elite power, actions by a few who have access and knowledge and can effectuate the manipulation of financial instruments in an off-the-balance sheet manner to actualize policy. The examples of these activities are the following: OSS-CIA, the Trust, energy ops, enterprise ops, and CONUS ops. And then he finishes with anomaly activities reflect an interpretation of Emile Durkheim's enlightened ascent model of the conflict between the authority of moral norms and the autonomy of moral ideas. The result of this conflict is normlessness or anomy. That is, within the context of the work, the total breakdown of international rules and laws that allow no rules, conditioned to exist in the international political and financial markets. This condition participated the events of Iran-Contra, BNL Iraqgate, and BCCI money laundering activities. Within this rules environment, BCCI can be observed to finance terrorism via legitimate corporate and banking practices encouraged by covert necessities of the Reagan-Bush administrations. And that is a lovely summary from Michael Cottrell, who was the business associate of Lee Wanta and has verified all the corporate structures that I have uncovered linked to Robert Booth Nichols, the gold being laundered from Ferdinand Marcos, together with the security notes and company partners that were exposed with the $250 billion US security note recovered by FBI from the bank vaults in London, and more importantly, Operation Still Point, with the correspondence and confirmation of all the records that I've uncovered myself and witnessed with the bogus prince who appeared in Australia on camera and destroyed the United Nations and Australian Federal Government United Trade Development Centre Point SEAL program, the Secure Electronic Authentication Link for Trade, with my companies when I represented genuine Spirus encryption technologies developed by Spirus and used by NSA and CIA with my business partner, the Johns Hopkins institutions. And it's all now linked to the same programs which have been demonstrated by William Casey for economic warfare with Lee Wanta, and all the evidence that Danny Casolaro was uncovering with PROMIS, the BCCI checks, and his investigations of the PROMIS software. And so when you look at the evidence of the book, it was William Casey that was the brains on setting up economic warfare to bankrupt the Soviet Union, with Herbert Mayer and Henry Rowan, together with Lee Wanta and Michael Cottrell. Operation Still Point. And so my evidence confirms overwhelmingly that the business partners, Stanford Research Institute, the business partner of Computer Power Group that developed the Lean software with artificial intelligence for Austrac to follow the money, was the PROMIS, CIA's PROMIS software, renamed the Lean software and sold to the Australian government and intelligence agencies, as testified in court by Michael Riconosciuto. Given that I worked for the company and know it well, and been able to confirm all of the annual reports and records, then this is further definitive evidence of the role that PROMIS was playing with all the banks and countries worldwide for following the money. And so the process was in many ways a breakthrough at the CIA. Intelligence assessments had always focused on Soviet strengths, but Mayer never their weaknesses. If intelligence was going to be a real tool for policy, and policymakers needed to know where the Soviets were weak, and so we could take advantage of it. And so Casey spent 1 hour nearly every day studying the Soviet economy. He practically invented the American concept of economic warfare when he served with the Economic Warfare Board during the Second World War. No one should be surprised that he was looking to hurt them. And it says here that another important neglected area of agency study was the psychological section. The CIA had for years asked psychologists and psychiatrists to write profiles on foreign officials. These were often pulled from biographical reports and the encounters other officials might have with them. But Bill Casey wanted something more relevant for the present. He wanted to know the psychological dimensions of the way the Soviet leadership viewed the United States. What frightened them? How was their ego resilience? How quickly did they bounce back from challenges? What would shake their confidence? And so there were indications early in the leadership was in trouble, recalls Professor Alan Whitaker, a clinical psychologist who had done work for the agency on the Soviet leadership, but it wasn't very specific. The hope was that we could get more specific information and then policymakers could use it. The first areas that Casey wanted the section to explore were the economy, Poland, and Afghanistan. And so what Casey was suggesting later became known as the Reagan Doctrine, an effort to finance and support anti-communist insurgencies around the world. Caspar Weinberg, Richard Allen, Alexander Haig liked the idea, and so did the president. Reagan asked the director to explore the matter in greater detail and identify insurgents who could be supported. And so on a flight home, reams of financial information were coming across Casey's transom. Herb Mayer, his special assistant, tasked with drawing up the vulnerability assessments of the Soviet economy, had stumbled across some interesting information. The Soviets had been selling gold heavily throughout 1981 in a very soft market. In 1980 they sold 90 tons, their usual amount. But by early November of 1981, they had cashed in 240 tons, and the volume was increasing. It was a telltale sign to both of us, recalls Mayer, that they were in big trouble. And then goes on to confirm that in Paris, January 19, COCOM meeting was secret to discuss American proposals. Created in 1949, COCOM was an attempt to forge unified Western response on technology and strategic trade with Soviet bloc. It is a secretive body, its internal actions unknown except to a precious few. The American delegation to the Paris meeting, headed by Under-Secretary of State James Buckley and Under-Secretary of Defense Fred Eichel, proposed 3 specific changes to COCOM process in light of current realities. And so we now have the emergence of the need for PROMIS software to track all technology patents or technology chips, and hence the company PROMIS Systems Inc. from Canada was responsible for tracking the CAD/CAM design of electronic boards and chips, and so it was contracted across to NATO. And so was the Wharton Economic Forecast Association was contracted to develop a full report on technology. I'll do that as a separate podcast, including IP Sharp, which is the companies that own PROMIS Systems Inc. were contracted to NATO as well. So the major application now was for COCOM to track all technologies for manufacturing of computer chips and computer boards, and anything to do with missile and Star Wars technology and satellites, submarines and weapons. Hence the need for PROMIS to capture and track all the databases across countries for the COCOM agreement. Encouraged by Bill Casey, Caspar Weinberg, Bill Clark had NSE undertake a series of studies exploring other ways to damage the Soviet economy. It would access the vulnerability of broad-scale economic war against Moscow, directed by Staff Planning Director Norm Bailey. The study explored the possible mechanisms of undermining the Soviet economy, including forging a grain cartel to include United States, Canada, Australia and Argentina to limit exports to the USSR. So these are the sanctions that they're going to hurt the economy by starving them, and that would put pressure on them not to spend their money on weapons and the military, given a dissatisfied population hungry. And so, as we can see, Bill Casey to a certain extent invented the field of American economic warfare. Casey's special assistant, Herb Mayer. At the Department of Defense, it was again Richard Pearl who led the way. At CIA, Casey had ambitious plans. He wanted an office devoted to tracking Soviet technology base and monitoring imports. And so they set up the Committee for Multilateral Export Controls, COCOM, and it comprised of all NATO countries except Iceland and Japan. And by early summer, Weinberg had dispatched Richard Pearl to begin the first round of secret trips to the European capitals to pressure allies to restrict technology exports to the Soviet bloc. Their area of most intense interest was the neutrals, Sweden, Switzerland and Austria. The message: tighten your export controls of risk losing access to licensed US technologies. And in the spring of 1984, senior interagency group on the transfer of strategic technology, headed by Undersecretary William Schneider, developed a new set of restrictions on technology exports to the Soviet transshipment scheme. The proposal was to tighten distribution of licenses controlled by the export of US high technology. That meant the example that if any company in a NATO country wanted to re-export a US controlled item to any non-NATO country, it would have to furnish the American government with a customer list to certify the product would not later be shipped to Moscow. The policy would apply to all US-controlled commodities that were re-exported under distribution license by West to neutral and third world countries. So it's the fox looking after the hen house. Ted Shackley's team with Richard Secord, Oliver North, Thomas Kleins, Albert Hakem are busy exporting technology to all the countries like Iran and Iraq and Libya and Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, given that they're in charge and developing the system using the PROMIS software. And while the Soviets were using flat-out theft to procure Western, they also purchased equipment from unscrupulous businessmen who would buy sensitive Western products and resell them to Moscow. They were obtaining 100 million computer circuits a year. They were purchasing manufacturing cells, complete production lines. By the late 1970s, Moscow was diverting billions of dollars worth of high-tech items. Most of the versions were arranged in Europe. Mr. President chimed in Weisberg, the neutrals, Sweden, Switzerland and Austria are leaking like sieves. And then the author of the book would like to thank Robert McFarlane, John Poindexter, Richard Allen, Herbert Mayer, Henry Rowan, William Schneider, Fred Eichel, Ed Meese, Alan Fires, David Wigg, Dewey Claridge, Charles Wick, Vincent Canestraro, for their assistance for review of the manuscript called Victory. This extensively researched study is fast-moving, exciting and accurate. The Reagan administration's secret strategy that hastened the collapse of the Soviet Union. And so the COCOM agreement was looking for applications of technology such as microelectronics, computers to military systems, precision-guided munitions, and the assessment also confirmed that Moscow was 10 years behind the United States in computer electronics and further behind electro-optic sensors, robotics, machine intelligence, signal processing, stealth and telecommunications. In fact, the MiG-25 aircraft contained only vacuum tubes and no solid-state circuitry in its avionics. And so the three lists, munitions, atomic energy and international, were revised and expanded. Added were computer software, telecommunications equipment, small military relevant computers were put into the final COPOM agreement. Around the world, the Technology Transfer Committee at CIA was engaged in the unprecedented worldwide monitoring of high technology trade flows. And so hence for PROMIS, it's got to interface with all the banks, particularly for credit, transfers, shipments of technology, to monitor those from different databases. And that was the advantage of Bill Hamilton's INSLAW software, is that it could easily integrate with disparate multi-vendor computer systems to be able to capture and do real-time analysis and statistics on data from multiple databases. It was the timing for that particular era when they desperately needed it, and of course when you're putting it into the banking systems, that's the top priority with the SWIFT banking to follow all the transactions of all banks for all transactions over $10,000. It says here the CIA's National Collection Division convinced several small Silicon Valley companies to design flawed mainframe computers and advanced satellites with all faults. The engineers had a ball, recalls one official, to these guys working on a black project. Purposely screwing up designs was tantalizingly challenging. Using discarded designs and other manufacturers, engineers put together a series of advanced designs that were sold to the Soviet agents for approximately $15,000. Rumour had it that some of the designs were still analysed and used as late as 1989. Quote, once you get garbage into the research and development cycle, it's hard to get it out, says one official. So they even were using the processes to stifle and set back. And there are examples where technology that was flawed was put into the oil industry, particularly for the process control systems, and that caused an explosion in one of the oil gas production lines for the Soviet Union. Now, how do I tie this to INSLAWing directly? Well, this is it. The author of the Soviet econometric model provided to CIA, NSA for William Casey. The key author was Lawrence Klein. He was the Nobel Prize winner, economics. So what's special about him? Well, he was the person responsible for setting up Project Link, the trade-off between military and civilian production in the Warsaw Pact countries. Project Link was the complete modelling of the Soviet economy by capturing the output of all imports and exports of banks, trade, from the Soviet Union, and it was called Project Link. It was to forecast and study the development of alternative prospects of a world economy. And so a total number of equations, it's a very sophisticated statistical model. There consists of 79 models and a total number of equations more than 20,000. And the linked data sets contain more than 1 million observations. So hence the need for PROMIS software to be put into all the banks in order to be able to capture the data, and particularly government systems for approval for trade in exports and imports to the Soviet Union. And why is that important? Well, in 1977, whilst he's doing this report and doing the modelling, if you go back here, their modelling was with DARPA, was being put forward for William Casey for the modelling of the whole economy. May 1977 is the final version of the model. Here is a paper where William Hamilton from Inslaw is working directly with Lawrence Klein, where they do the modelling of a PROMIS software system for relevance to capital punishment. Given that claims were being made by another researcher, it turns out that William Hamilton teamed up with Lawrence Klein from Pennsylvania, the Wharton School, and they're working on the modelling using the PROMIS software. So the chances of them coming together for Inslaw and an evaluation of the PROMIS software and the PROMIS team using all the data in order to refute a claim being made by another researcher. So we have a direct link. Why is that important? Well, I also then went into the US Naval Research Labs and found that Project Link, developed by Professor Klein, was being automated and put into computer systems for the Information Systems Program for the Office of Naval Research in Virginia as part of their modelling systems. And hence we now have an overlap of economic modelling and the expertise of databases for banks and modelling of the Soviet economy, but also the natural language or smart systems being developed by the same team. And it turns out that one of the first graduates under Professor Klein is a Jorg Garner. In fact, his name is Jorg L. Garner, and he's responsible for his thesis in writing up an automatic program generator for model building in social and engineering science, which they did for the Navy research laboratories in Virginia. And here it is, dated 1978. It was being developed right through from 71 through to 78, and it turns out that Jorg Garner was also working on a LEA grant for the modelling of justice systems. So we have a programmer and researcher working in Navy research laboratories in Virginia, involved with modelling and computer development systems for LEA, for the justice law enforcement systems, which PROMIS and Inslaw are working on, and also he's the person developing the models, economic models, for Professor Klein with the US Navy Research Laboratory. What's interesting is that he confirms that he's developing a depth first search algorithm was implemented in model processor. Find cycles of simultaneous equations, procedural specifications, blocks of simultaneous equations are grouped together. See, the statistics and simultaneous equations and solutions for economic modelling are also used in scientific simulation work, which is applicable for tracking submarines and other data that you're trying to correlate. It says here a small income expenditure model of the US economy. Klein's model number 1 is used to illustrate the model specification needed to automatically generate an interactive simulation program. Several other examples from the field of economics are given to exemplify different features of the model. So he's developing this. He says, I would like to express my gratitude to Dr. Noah S. Priories for his advice to the Information Systems Branch of the Office of Naval Research. And also he'd like to thank for the guidance of Dr. Lawrence Klein for his support, motivation and wonderful offered by Project Link. So this is now INSLAW overlapping with the economic models used for economic warfare by William Casey, with the same development team from the Wharton Econometric Forecasting Association with Professor Klein. It says here that the Link project, also held at Wharton Econometric Forecasting Associates, is the world's first global macroeconomic model. Date 1980, and of course they've been developing that with the Navy research. This paper by Professor Klein also shows that it's a statistical model of the world economy. It's been provided to the UN's United Nations Secretariat, has used the Link model for the purpose of short-term and medium-term projections of the world economy and for policy simulations. And among them, a sustainable development at a global level. The author discusses Link's forecast for 3 main issues: the oil embargo of 1973 and changes in terms of trade with respect to oil prices, the end of the Cold War and the emergence of the peace dividend, and then the last part is the reduction of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. It says that it show how our global model can deal with political, social, environmental and economic events that are extreme importance for the development. So for this to be a thesis with the Navy research and the people involved is Professor Klein, I thought, I wonder who Noah is. I then found the papers on the decade of research for the Project Link. It was put in at the International Monetary Fund. The National Science Foundation funded it, and it confirms the direction of Mr. Klein at the Link Secretariat, Department of Economics, and the University of Pennsylvania. And it's been installed at the Austrian National Bank, the Bank of Finland, the Bank of Greece, the Bank of Japan, the Bank of Sweden, Belgian National Science Foundation, and the Federal Reserve System. The Canada Council, the Centre of Planning and Economic Research in Athens, the European Economic Community, the German Bundesbank, the German Research Association, Institute for Advanced Studies of Vienna, Italian Science Foundation, Japan Economic Research Center, United Nations, and the US Departments of Agriculture, Commerce, Energy, State, and Treasury. So it is in the Federal Reserve System. It's also in US Treasury, and it's also for Agriculture, Commerce, and Energy, and State Department. So going back again, I'd like to express my gratitude to Dr. Noah S. papyri. So we know that Dr. Lawrence Klein was engaged to review the PROMIS software and database systems in 1977 with William Hamilton from Inslaw, and at the same time developing Project Link with US Naval Research. And then I found the resume of Professor Emeritus Noah S. Pyrus. He was born in Warsaw, Poland. Isn't it wonderful how the economic warfare is starting with Poland? He emigrated with his family to pre-state Israel in 1933 and attended the Technion Israel Institute of Technology and to study electrical engineering. So he has a link with both Poland and Israel. He has a PhD in applied physics, qualifications like myself in applied physics and computer science. He worked on the first LARC computer, which was one of the world's first supercomputers. So his expertise is in supercomputing. He created and invented with patents, I've got all his patents now, Multilist, one of the first relational database management systems. So his expertise is in the management of relational database management systems. And he advanced and commercialized time sharing computers, expertise in parallel and distributed computing, which is essential for integrating PROMIS software into all the banks worldwide and across all NATO systems for defence with Army, Navy, tracking of submarines and signature data of nuclear submarines. And it says here that he also invented an automated payroll systems and financial reporting for Wall Street banks. So there's his overlap with the Wall Street bankers, Federal Reserve, and the real-time systems for aerospace and military, particularly naval systems. And then I found his company. It was called Computer Command and Control Company. Development of real-time naval strategic command and control systems. Advanced Warfare Systems Division, Naval Analysis Group, Office of Naval Research, Department of Naval, Washington. And there's the company registration, founded in 1963 right through to 1999. And there he is, the President and Chief Scientist. And I then found his reports. He's developed what's called Office of Naval Research, Department of Naval, Arlington, Virginia, and he has created a man-computer problem-solving in real-time Navy simulation duels between ships and submarines. It's an interactive problem-solving computer system, and it's designed for computational methods and strategy in the areas of tracking and navigation, sonar applications, processing and weapons application. So this is for the full simulation of US Navy and NATO submarine warfare, particularly against the Soviet Union. Michael Riconosciuto repeatedly told me that the PROMIS software was used for simulation by NATO for their operations and training exercises in Europe. And indexes of his reports talk about naval problem-solving facilities, navigation and tracking, sonar analysis and processing, active sonar estimates, processing active sonar readings, passive sonar analysis, weapon systems, weapon firing using a procedure, weapon launching, confirmation of weapon firing, weapon status, submarine captains, captain of destroyer, passive sonar interception calculations. So Michael had testified the first application of the PROMIS software was for NATO and the US Navy and it was put into the fire command control systems for the Trident submarine. We know that Hadron was developing with Earl Bryan, was developing the fire control systems for command control systems for the Trident submarines. We have evidence, and I've done that in a prior podcast. More importantly, this is now overlapping with the economic modelling and capturing all data at all banks worldwide. So the second application was for following the money. And so we have confirmation that Norman Bailey confirmed to William Hamilton that NSA was using his PROMIS software for the follow the money program for SWIFT banking program worldwide. And we've also confirmed COCOM. And the partnerships include Rand, Wharton Econometric, Forecasting Associates and Stanford Research. And as I say, Stanford Research was a joint venture partner with Computer Power Group. So in summary, we have proven the PROMIS software. I called it the 6I. It's a private intelligence group that carries out covert intelligence operations in USA, Australia, Canada, England, Germany, France, Europe, wherever, privately funded, involving Ted Shackley's team and his other members of the far-right fascist groups in 6I and Le Circle to bypass legislation restrictions placed upon CIA, that it cannot carry out surveillance and intelligence operations domestically. Most importantly, we've confirmed that the 6I was a secret Catholic group which involves the Catholic Opus Dei and Knights of Malta. I've proven that it's Ted Shackley, Henry Kissinger, William Casey, William Colby, all members of CIA who are also members of the Sovereign Military Order of Malta. Seems to be the common thread that transcends all borders and has a higher level secrecy, transcends all intelligence agencies for this private funded group called Le Circle or the 6I. We have confirmed that the key people involved with Ted Shackley is Ted Shackley, Herb Mayer, James Critchfield, Norman Bailey, Ralph Garage, Richard Stilwell, Don Jamieson, to name a few. And it's linked to Wackle. And of course, he then sets up a continuation of this in 1994 with Julian Amory, a Conservative MP, former chairman of Le Circle, and Richard McCormack, Robert Zolli, and Thomas Spencer. Richard McCormack is the attorney who was representing Richard Singlaub, or Richard Singlaub and Oliver North in their legal case by the Christic Institute. And now we come back to the beginning. That Chuck Missler, who was a director of Hadron and was appointed the chairman and CEO of Hellanetics, the SDI Star Wars program, does know what they were doing. but has become extremely concerned of this elite power, and I'm talking about Robert Gray, William Simon, Bernard Kratz, Earl Bryan, and Ted Shackley's secret team, with the elite power and manipulation of capital markets, as outlined by Michael C. Cottrell, who was the business partner of Leo Wanta in Operation Steel Point, to the movement of gold bullion from Philippines, from Japan, from Indonesia, from Germany, from the Soviet Union, through the Citibank, Project Hammer, through World Bank, through the Rothschilds banks. There is overwhelming evidence that this is a secret power elite, and the common threads seem to be the Sovereign Military Order of Malta, or the Knights of Malta, and the Rothschilds banks seem to be behind everything. The World Bank, IMF, the establishment of the Vatican Bank, Ambri Oceana, the movement of gold, bullion, currencies, and the laundering of drugs and illegal arms for fascist dictators worldwide in the name of national security and to fight communism. With the Wackle Group, Le Circle, 6i. So we come back to Michael's testimony in court and his interviews. Categorically, the first application, NATO and US Navy, modified PROMIS software for tracking Soviet nuclear submarines. It was integrated into missile fire control and command systems of the US Trident submarines using the VAX 11 780 computers. Has been substantiated independently. His second application, he said, was the modified PROMIS software was for SWIFT banking. It was installed at Transaction Technologies Inc., a subsidiary of Citibank, for Dr. Earl Bryan, chairman of Hadron Inc. and CIA, to move covert funds through the international automatic clearing houses. We've been able to confirm that as Project Hammer. And so the testimony of General Earl Cockey, serving as a senior executive of the World Bank, president of Nugan Bank, Washington, and confirms that CIA Project Hammer is laundering gold and drugs and weapons through Citibank and the Rothschilds banks. And in his statements, without repeating back again, Project Hammer was an extension of Nugan Bank, and he had acted as a consultant to Adnan Khashoggi. Project Hammer was operated by the Federal Reserve, US Treasury, CIA, FBI, Secret Service security agencies to recover the proceeds from their arms, gold and drugs trading activities that were illegally diverted by major banks. Also to recover and generate funds to pay off debts on bullion certificates issued by certain metal trusts. And that Project Hammer was the continuation of the Nugan Bank, CIA's bank, set up in Australia. And the most important thing is, confirms that St. Peter's bankers, Robert Calvi, Michelle Sindona, Archbishop Paul Masinkas, that the funds stolen from Banco Ambrosiano had been moved through Bankers Trust with A.B. Krongard, who was the Vice Chairman of Bankers Trust, a Director of Johns Hopkins Medicine, prior to becoming the Executive Director of CIA. And we have confirmed categorically that Robert Booth Nichols was working with Ted Shackley, Frank Colucci, William Colby to move billions of dollars of gold bullion certificates in Switzerland owned by Ferdinand Marcos through the Nugenhan Bank, and drugs and arms linked to the Gambino Mafia, the Medellin cartels and the Yakuza. And so my legal dispute with Johns Hopkins Medicine and Johns Hopkins institutions led me to A.B. Krongard. And it's clear that Operation Still Point with Leah Wanta, Michael Cottrell, who were involved with bankrupting the Soviet Union with the movement of gold bullion certificates of trade, drugs, on behalf of CIA with William Casey, Herbert Mayer, and working directly for President Reagan, had put me in conflict with number 3 man in CIA. Operation Still Point, the Pentagon spy that tipped off Bill Hamilton that I was upsetting, Paul Wolfords, Richard Pearl, Douglas Faith and Scooter Libby, also met with Christopher Story, who was investigating PROMIS and the CIA Operation Still Point involving Leo Wanta. And there's the overlap between the two of us. And he was advised by Gordon Thomas, who was investigating, and the author of Robert Maxwell, Israel Super Spy, and the theft of the PROMIS software, was the one that put him into contact with Demchuk. The most important thing is that Christopher Story was best known for his collaboration with KGB defector Anatoly Golitsyn, who is the same KGB defector who was under the responsibility of Donald Jamison, the director of Research Associates International with Ted Shackley. In addition, he was also investigating currencies and fraud involving the World Bank, the Federal Reserve and the Bank of England. More importantly, he met with Leo Wanta and Michael Cottrell to investigating their overwhelming documentary evidence of George H.W. Bush and CIA Operation Still Point involving a secret $1 trillion money laundering transactions through Citibank and World Bank. And before Christopher Story died in 2010, he was investigating evidence of Leo Wanta's link to the Global Security Fund set up by Jacob Rothschild, who is the investor behind Inslaw Inc. and the investor behind Rupert Murdoch's company, Computer Power Group, both who had the PROMIS software. And so we've come in a round robin now that Chuck Missler is not your average Christian evangelist. He knows how the elite power works. In the name of national security and his research and his leadership in developing encryption technologies and AWAC, stealth fighter, bombers, missile technology, Star Wars programs and technology, he was chased out of Hellenetics with a dispute with Bernard Katz, who was the same investor behind Earl Bryant's companies, Exonics Inc., which became Hadron Inc. The team of Exonics Inc. was working on technologies in sonar detection of sonar towing buoys for the Navy to track submarines, and then Hadron Inc. had access to the PROMIS software for development of the command control and fire control systems for the Trident nuclear submarines. And in the company is Robert Gray, who is linked to Ted Shackley, Ed Wilson, Richard Secord, Eric von Mambod, Thomas Kleins and Michael Ledeen, all members of Le Circle and 6i. And of course, William Simon is in director of Citibank with John Deutsch, C. Michael Armstrong, the chairman of Johns Hopkins Institutions, President Gerald Ford, who mysteriously appears offering to negotiate a $100 million settlement for my companies over the fraud committed by Johns Hopkins against my companies in Australia, particularly the CIA, Operation Still Point, operation that destroyed all our credible projects and works that I had worked on for years to set up the United Nations and had personally negotiated with the Australian federal government for encryption technologies with Spirus Inc., who provide all the Rosetta encryption technology used by CIA and NSA. And this is my journey of now bringing it back. My research shows definitively through years and years of research over 20 years that the common thread was P2 Lodge, Sovereign Military Order of Malta, CIA, PROMIS software, leading to the Rothschilds banking empire, with the World Bank and the Vatican Bank, Banca Ambrosiana, BCCI, Bankers Trust, A.B. Krongard, number 3 man in the CIA. And of course, worse than that is that the business partners who had defrauded me, their director-owned Business Risk International, who employed Major Joseph Queller, who we believe murdered Danny Casolaro, given that he had the BCCI checks financed by Robert Gray, William Casey, and the Kuwait royal family for Adnan Khashoggi and manager Ghorbanifar, provided by a CIA agent, Robert Sensi, employed by William Casey and Robert Gray. And so the testimony and message confirmed by Chuck Missler, who knows how ultimate power works, has written many books about the threat of the New World Order and the power or elite power behind the capital markets. And he clearly was warning that the Rothschilds are behind the formation of a one world government for a one coming world leader. He also, and I will attach a video speech where he gives warnings against the occult of the Freemasons, that the 32nd and 33rd degree learn that the architect of the universe that they believe in is really the Antichrist. And so that completes my research, CIA's Holy Crusaders, the disillusioned secret team, members of the 6i and the Knights of Malta, who were money laundering drugs and arms in the name of God.